A mountaintop marathon is the backdrop for a brutal homicide.
The victim was shot in the chest with a .25 caliber handgun.
Once that bullet's in your chest, it's in for the grand tour. They become a pinball in a pinball machine.
On the hunt for the killer, Lieutenant Joe Kenda uncovers an unusual trail of clues.
17 condoms in cellophane wrappers. That's a lot of condoms. What are they doing here?
But to solve the crime, he'll need to summit a mountain of lies, innuendo, and muddled eyewitness reports.
We have to play this game to get to the truth. But that's the nature of the beast. You have to play a game. I'm good at the game. There's one thing that never changes: murder. A life has been taken. Their stories are now my stories. I'm Lieutenant Joe Kenda. I've solved over 387.
It's 3 days before the running of the annual Pikes Peak Marathon.
The Pikes Peak Ascent is a foot race up along Bar Trail up to the top of Pikes Peak.
For runners, it's a big deal, and you're getting a lot of people coming in from out of state to run that Pikes Peak Marathon.
That evening, as the sun sets over the mountain, it's easy to see why the race draws so many visitors to Colorado Springs.
It was one of those absolutely beautiful summer nights in Colorado Springs. You walked outside and you went, this is heaven.
But this picture-perfect scene is about to be ripped apart in the most violent way imaginable. In a shopping center not far from Pikes Peak, assistant manager Joe Bricardo works the counter at a local drugstore.
I was working with a customer over in the camera department.
Suddenly, a man bursts through the door in a state of panic.
Somebody's been shot.
Call 911 right now.
I'm a deputy with the Sheriff's Department.
The lady I was helping identified herself as an off-duty sheriff's deputy, and she came out as well.
Don't touch him.
When they reach the victim, he's lying on his back. It's clear he's been shot in the chest. The off-duty deputy kneels down to check his vitals.
I'm not getting anything.
She felt for a pulse and did not find one.
Joe Bricardo tries his best to comfort the wounded man, but he's fading fast.
He was definitely in a deep sense of shock. I said that we're going to do everything we can to help you.
While the victim clings to life, sirens blare as paramedics race to the scene. Across town, Lieutenant Joe Kenda is ready to call it a day.
I had just gotten home. It had been a long day at the office. I was going to sit down and get something to eat when the phone rang.
The moment Kenda answers,
Hello?
he realizes dinner will have to wait. On the line is dispatch. There's been a shooting.
Where is it? I'll be right there.
The neighborhood was a commercial district, certainly not a high-crime area.
By the time Kenda arrives at the scene, paramedics have already rushed the victim to the hospital, and a small crowd has gathered in the parking lot.
Hey folks, you mind making a hole here?
Excuse me.
Hey Lieutenant.
How you doing?
All right.
What do we got?
White male, shot possibly twice.
My first mission when I get there is to speak to the first uniformed officers on the scene. What can you tell me?
We've got a couple of people that were in the pharmacy, say they didn't see anything. We've got another guy saying he thinks it was a drive-by, but he hasn't given us a whole lot to go on.
How old was the victim?
He looked to be mid-70s maybe.
A 70-year-old man? I can't picture a 70-year-old man being a gangbanger.
Kenda scans the scene and notices a number of cars parked in the surrounding lot.
Which one of these vehicles is his?
We haven't found a vehicle in the parking lot that goes with him.
You've checked them all.
Yes, sir.
There are no cars unaccounted for. So he apparently is walking. either in this area or to and from this business when he is somehow contacted and shot.
All right, thank you.
Absolutely.
Why is he on foot? Why isn't there a car here that belongs to this person?
This is where the witnesses found the victim. His feet were this direction, his head was over here, and laying on his back, he had a single bullet wound to his chest.
Okay.
We are able to locate a small blood stain on the asphalt in the immediate vicinity where the victim was.
And then we were able to locate one shell casing.
What caliber is it?
It was a 25 caliber.
I look at that bloodstain and look at that small bullet casing, and my first thought is, uh-oh, this is going to be a homicide. If you're shot with a high-energy, large-caliber handgun, it's going to punch a hole in one side and punch a hole in the other side. Small caliber is a whole different problem. They are low energy, low velocity, enough punch to enter, but once that bullet's in your chest, it's in for the grand tour. It is a nightmare for a surgeon. He can't possibly repair the structure damage fast enough. They're almost always fatal. Almost always.
As Kenda examines the shell casing, another piece of evidence catches his eye.
About 20 yards north of the bloodstain are 17 condoms.
Loose condoms, individually wrapped, they were multicolored.
That's a lot of condoms. What are they doing here? You've got a 25 caliber casing and a small bloodstain. You have an elderly man who's apparently been shot to death in front of a drugstore in a no-crime area at 9 o'clock at night, and there's 17 condoms in the parking lot. What does this translate to? I haven't got a clue.
865 to Lieutenant Kenda.
Kenda tries to make sense of this bizarre scene when he gets a call from one of his men.
Go ahead for Lieutenant Kenda.
Sir, I'm at the hospital. That
Victim from the pharmacy shooting, he's been pronounced dead.
With the case now officially a homicide, the question of motive looms larger than ever.
The first officers in the scene assume personal robbery because of the location. That's entirely possible.
Do you have any belongings on this person?
10-4, he had
A wallet and a set of keys on him.
Can you check the contents of the wallet?
there's a small amount of cash.
Credit cards, that kind of thing.
Well, I expect him to tell me that he's got nothing. He's got no wallet, no money, no ID. I'm really surprised to learn he's got everything. Well, that's not a robbery.
The notion of a deadly armed robbery may be off the table, but the victim's wallet does provide new evidence.
Anything else that might help identify where he came from?
Sure, I got an Arkansas driver's license for a Robert Elsher.
He has an Arkansas driver's license. His name is Robert L. Elshire. So he's 1,000 miles from home at 9 o'clock at night. How did he get here? How did he get here?
It's just before midnight on August 18th, 1993, 3 days before the running of the annual Pikes Peak Marathon. As the athletes rest up for the difficult ascent, Lieutenant Joe Kenda and his team stand in the middle of a parking lot turned crime scene, wondering who shot and killed 71-year-old Robert Elshire and why.
I get a call from a detective at the hospital. Everything in his wallet says he's from the state of Arkansas, including his driver's license. How did he get here?
Sifting through the contents of Robert Elshire's wallet, one of Kenda's men makes a discovery that might answer that question.
Oh wait, there's a business card here for a condominium complex just a couple blocks away.
10-4, I'm gonna need you and Detective Ritz to go over there, take a look around, see what you find, and report back to me.
10-4.
In search of the victim's vehicle, a pair of Kenda's men make their way to the condo complex.
Arkansas over here, partner.
Moments later, they find what they're looking for.
They do find a pickup truck with Arkansas plates. They run a listing on a handheld radio with the comm center, and it comes back to Robert L. and Helen Elshire. That's the truck.
Detectives shine their flashlights inside the vehicle, looking for clues. But their search is cut short.
Robert?
On the second floor, a woman says, "Robert, is that you?"
Ma'am, we're with the Colorado Springs Police Department. Do you know a Robert Elshire?
Yes, that's my husband. What's happened?
Do you mind if we come up and have a word?
The woman identifies herself as Helen Elshire, Robert Elshire's wife.
She sees them approaching and puts her hand over her mouth and says, "Oh God, what has happened?" Because these aren't just policemen, they're policemen in suits.
What happened?
Ma'am, did I understand you correctly? You're Robert's wife?
Yes, I'm Helen Elshire. What's happened to Robert?
Obviously, at that point, we are really bound to tell her that her husband is deceased.
We're sorry to inform you that your husband has passed away.
She collapses in his arms. It's the grief reaction that you dread witnessing, but you witness every time.
How could something like this happen? Especially when you've always tried to live your life, to be a good person, to do for others, which my father and mother did over and over again.
Detectives try to give Helen Elshire time to process the terrible news, but the clock is ticking.
There's a killer on the loose. We need information from Helen Elshire, and we need it right now.
I know this is difficult, ma'am, but if you could just answer a few of our questions, it would really help out with the investigation.
We try to find out why they're in Colorado Springs.
What brings you to Colorado?
Oh, we come every year. My husband loves to run the Pikes Peak Marathon.
She explains that her husband, Robert, is an avid runner, and it is his habit to come to Colorado Springs to run the Pikes Peak Marathon.
Always, Mom would be there with him, and she'd be at the top of the mountain waiting for him to arrive.
Helen informs detectives that earlier that evening, she came down with a splitting headache.
I just cannot get rid of this headache.
Yeah. I'll go get you something.
Be careful.
There was a drugstore nearby, and he's like, "Honey, you know, I'll go pick up some medicine for you." And it was a nice summer night. He was an athletic man, so he probably was just enjoying walking over there.
According to Helen, not long after Robert left, she heard sirens and got a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach.
She didn't know what it was or if it pertained to anything to do with my father, but she felt uncomfortable.
Sadly, Helen's instincts were correct.
Robert Elshire is a retired electrician, 71 years old. He represents what America is supposed to be. You have a wife and 4 wonderful children. What better guy could there be than Robert Elshire? His only crime is to walk up a street trying to buy some medication for his wife.
If you can think of anything else, please give us a call. I'm so sorry for your loss. We'll show ourselves out.
Who would want a man like Robert Elshire dead? A fellow marathon runner with an axe to grind? Or perhaps someone from Robert's life back in Arkansas? Neither one of these theories sit well with Kenda.
You begin to wonder, where can we go? Who can we talk to? All you're looking for is a new idea. Every murder case has a point of despair, and sometimes that repeats. We're no closer to catching this guy than we were when we arrived on this scene.
But no sooner has doubt set in than an eyewitness steps forward with game-changing information.
I'm Detective Kenda.
Her name is Julie Canfield Chandy.
You know something about this?
I might know something that happened earlier that might be related.
According to Julie, just moments after the shooting, she had a strange and nearly fatal encounter on the road adjacent to the drugstore parking lot.
All of a sudden, this kid comes running out of nowhere in the middle of the street.
She says a kid runs in front of her car to the point to where she has to slam on the brakes because she almost hits him. He looks at her and she looks at him.
She described this party as Hispanic and that he was wearing a pair of gray pants at the time.
She's absolutely certain that they're gray.
Did you get a good look at him?
I got a pretty good look at him. He kind of stopped right in front of my car.
He runs across the street and embraces a second person, who she says is another kid, about his age, 15 or 16, but she doesn't get a good look at him.
And the two of them took off running towards the apartment complex just east of this location.
Armed with this information,
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Kenda takes another look at the pile of condoms and is struck with an idea.
Do they sell these in that drugstore? I didn't think anybody bought them in there. I thought they could have been stolen from there. Shoplifted. So I go to the drugstore and I contact the assistant manager.
Do you sell these in your store? No, sir, not those kind. No.
I show him these condoms. Do you sell those in your store? No, I don't, but I've seen them before.
I had 3 kids coming in, probably.
That's when assistant manager Joe Bricardo tells Kenda the story of another odd encounter, one he had in the store a few hours earlier.
3 young men came in the store. One was African American and 2 were Hispanic. The African American and the older Hispanic were probably about 16 or 17, and the younger one was probably 12 years old.
The black kid's got a really wicked scar on the left side of his face. A serious, apparent, obvious scar. Okay.
According to Joe Bricardo, after entering the store, he noticed the 3 boys were carrying something unusual.
They had a number of condoms with them, and they wanted to make sure we didn't think that they were stealing them. Okay. So I told them to put everything in a bag and we'll keep it behind the counter.
Right here.
Joe Bricardo tells Kenda that he asked the boys where they got all the condoms.
Well, there's an alcohol treatment center, and we took them out of there.
We did keep a little bit of a close eye on them because they seemed a little bit suspicious. After they did their shopping, they did come back up to the front cashier and ask for their bag back with the condoms, and I gave it to them. I just kind of made a joke.
Planning on having a big weekend?
No.
Not really. All right, have a nice day.
They left the store, and that was the last of it.
It's an unusual story, but Joe Bricardo's description of the condoms is a match for the ones found near the crime scene.
Now I can connect those condoms to a Hispanic male who's 15 or 16, just like Julie saw. Are these my shooters? They certainly could be.
Listen up. I need all available units to set up a 20-block perimeter at every intersection. Check everything coming in or out.
Yes,
all right,
sir.
let's get to it.
Because of the time frame, I tell the patrol supervisor I want 20 blocks. Now, you say to yourself, well, a person can run pretty far in a few minutes. Yeah, they can. But humans don't continue to run. They get tired, they get frightened, they want to see if they're being followed. 20 blocks should be more than enough. If these people are still on foot, you're basically building a fishing net, and you're slowly going to pull the string. You catch a lot of fish, but you throw a lot of fish back.
Within minutes, Kenda's dragnet snags its first catch.
How you doing?
Keep on driving.
Come on, get the hood, come on. Come on.
Have a seat. Watch your head.
63 to Lieutenant Kenda.
Moments later, Kenda is notified that patrolmen have a young male in custody who matches the description of one of his suspects.
63, I've got a possible homicide suspect, the Hispanic male wearing the black jacket.
Blue jeans and white sneakers.
Good, take him to the station. I'm on my way.
We find a guy. He's a Hispanic male. He's 17 years old. They asked him where he's been. He names the liquor store in the complex where our victim was shot. It's not a throwback. He's a keeper.
Just days before the Pikes Peak Marathon, 71-year-old runner Robert Elshire has been gunned down in a shopping center parking lot in Colorado Springs. After setting up a 20-block perimeter around the crime scene, Lieutenant Joe Kenda has reeled in a promising suspect.
We find a guy named Jerry Chavez. He's a Hispanic male. He's 17 years old. He's evasive, and he's wanted on warrants. Oh, I like him. So him I think we'll keep.
Jerry Chavez fits the general description of one of the young men identified by drugstore manager Joe Bricardo and motorist Julie Canfield Chandy.
They asked him where he's been. He names the liquor store in the complex where our victim was shot. That's excellent. So you're telling us you were there?
Detectives escort Jerry Chavez down to the station. A few minutes later, Kenda joins him in the interrogation room.
Jerry, right?
Yeah.
His initial attitude is basically drop dead. He's a typical unhappy customer. He hates the police. He doesn't mind telling you that.
Jerry, why don't you tell me what you were doing in that neighborhood where they picked you up?
I was going to the liquor store.
Kenda puts up with Chavez's bad attitude for a minute, then informs him he's being questioned in connection to a homicide.
The reason you're here, Jerry, is because there was a homicide in that shopping complex.
A what?
His whole demeanor changes. That scares him, because he knows that that's trouble that doesn't stop.
A murder. And I got a feeling you know something about that.
No, I don't.
He puts two and two together and says, wait a minute, I was in a different liquor store. He's already changing his story, not even in response to questions. He's a suspicious guy. Is he our guy? I don't know, but I certainly don't know that he isn't. So we need to look into him further.
Kenda decides the best thing to do at this point is to turn Jerry Chavez over to the crime lab.
Well, here's what we're gonna do, Jerry. I'm gonna take your clothes. I'm gonna have them tested for gunshot residue and blood spatter.
Man, whatever you need to do.
You okay with that?
I didn't do this.
All right, stand up and take them off.
We're going to test you for gunshot residue on your hands. We're going to inspect your clothes. We're looking for high-velocity blood spatter.
Lab techs run Jerry Chavez's clothes and hands through the GSR kit, but the tests come back negative, and Kenda has no choice but to cut his petulant suspect loose.
Jerry's a jerk. But being an asshole is not against the law. If it were, we'd have to erect a fence around the state of Colorado and inform everyone they're in custody. We have to go with what we can prove, and right now we can't prove much.
With Jerry Chavez off the hook, Kenda waits patiently as officers working his perimeter inch their way closer to the crime scene. But after hours of searching, they're no closer to apprehending their suspects. So Kenda decides it's time to call in the big dogs, or to be more accurate, the big dog, a canine officer named Axe.
A dog is used by law enforcement agencies as a sophisticated tool. We have one dog that's a tracking dog. His whole mission in life is to track scents.
Kenda hopes Axe can help determine which direction the perpetrator or perpetrators fled once they shot Robert Elshire. It doesn't take long for Axe to hit pay dirt.
He picks up a scent and starts to track north. Now, our witness Julie says our guy is north of the scene running across the street, and this dog is headed in that direction like a torpedo.
Axe leads Kenda and his men to an apartment complex 53 yards away. Then, without warning, Axe stops dead in his tracks.
He stops near a bush and sits down. It's an alert signal. There's something here, guys. We look under this bush, and there is a Ruger target pistol, Mark I. It hasn't been thrown under this bush, it's been placed there.
Kenda orders officers to collect the weapon and move on, following their canine's lead.
The dog continues to work the scent, There's an 8-foot wooden fence separating this complex from private homes. And what's there on the ground?
We got more condoms.
8 more condoms. Same ones, same brand. So this is no question. These are the guys from the parking lot. There's our condoms.
Then, in an instant, Axe's ears perk up. Officers notice 2 figures moving in the shadows.
Police, step out where I can see you!
2 kids come out of the area where we found the first gun.
Police canine, stop or release the dog!
He challenges them with the dog. Now the dog is going bananas. Everybody's afraid of dogs.
Don't move, hands on your head!
They stop dead in their tracks.
Kenda approaches the young men to get a better look.
These 2 individuals both roughly fit the description. One is a Hispanic male. He says he's 17. His name is Alan Lucero. His friend, his name is Damian Nicholas. Damian says that he is 17 years old.
What you guys doing here?
Nothing, chilling outside. Yeah.
It appears Kenda has found his suspects. But as he examines the boys more closely, he notices some discrepancies between their appearance and the eyewitness descriptions he's been given.
We're looking for a black male with a severe scar on the left side of his face. Damian is a black male. He does not have a scar on his face. We're looking for a Hispanic male in gray pants.
They're in the right location, they're same physical build, but we don't have anything to say they're actual suspects. So we treat them as witnesses.
After hauling the boys downtown and placing them in separate interrogation rooms, Kenda and Detective Brian Ritz start with Damian Nicholas, who seems eager to cooperate.
Damian is friendly. Damian's a nice-looking kid. Seems not nervous at all, not the least bit upset. Wants to be helpful to the police.
Damn, you didn't happen to go to the drugstore tonight, did you?
No, not to the drugstore.
You didn't? Can't tell me what you did tonight?
Well, what I did is, me and Alan, we were with my girl all night.
Damian explains that he and Alan spent most of their night watching movies at the home of his girlfriend, Vida Mays. After that, the 2 boys left.
So they were walking back when the officers came across them.
And when we seen you guys, we also seen the dog. And we were just scared, so we just started running.
Damian is providing me very plausible information. He's very forthcoming. His detail is fairly good. It's enough to where I began to question whether or not he was actually involved in this crime.
All right. Just stay put for a little bit.
But before Kenda will release Damian, he wants to sit down with Damian's friend, Alan Lucero, who wastes no time contradicting his friend's sworn statement.
What can you tell me about this shooting outside of the pharmacy? Maybe I know who did it.
Well, you say maybe. What's maybe mean? If you think you know who did it, then you better tell me.
"71-year-old retiree Robert Elshire was in town to run the annual Pikes Peak Marathon. But on a late-night walk to buy aspirin for his wife, he was viciously gunned down in a shopping center parking lot.
You just get sick to your stomach that these people come here to Colorado to enjoy the beauty of the Rocky Mountains and wind up in the middle of this nightmare.
Thanks to the help of a trusted canine officer, Lieutenant Joe Kenda has tracked down 2 potential suspects.
Don't move, hands on your head!
17-year-old Alan Lucero and 17-year-old Damian Nicholas.
So they don't closely match these people that we believe we're looking for, but they are in this area, and it's worthy enough to speak to them about what they may know.
After questioning Damian Nicholas, Kenda is all but convinced these young men aren't the guys he's looking for. But when he questions Alan Lucero,
what can you tell me about this shooting outside of the pharmacy?
Alan makes a shocking revelation.
Maybe I know who did it. What's maybe mean? I do know. It's Damian Nicholas.
He says his friend, Damian, shot and killed Robert Elshire.
Can you tell me about it? Started off, we were at his girlfriend Vita's house.
According to Alan, around 8 o'clock, He and Damien left Vita's house and headed over to the Valley High Shopping Center, where Damien got an idea.
He needed some money. He had a gun. He had more than one gun, and he was going to see if he could find somebody to rob.
Alan walked across the street to wait for Damien. Moments later,
Give me money.
he heard a gunshot and saw his friend running towards him.
All of a sudden, he comes running back across the street, says he shot the dude, and we better run. And we ran. I had a gun, I put it under the bush. It was a .22, and he had a .25 auto, and he had a .380. He had two guns, and we threw them in a yard in the neighborhood.
Alan Lucero's story seems to gel with the evidence, but there's one unexplained detail that's still nagging at Kenda.
We found a bunch of condoms in the parking lot and more by the fence. What's up with that?
They were just in the parking lot. I guess they fell out as we were running.
That's when Kenda has an epiphany.
We find out in all probability we have different individuals. Alan Lucero and Damien Nicholas were not the same individuals that had walked in with the condoms when they went into that store.
For Kenda, now comes the hard part, verifying Lucero's version of events.
You say, Alan, that you know where these other two guns are. Yes, I do. Show us where they are.
And you can take us to him?
I can.
All right, let's go.
All right.
Alan Lucero leads Kenda and his team back to the apartment complex where he and Damien were initially picked up.
He pointed out where one gun was hidden. That was the gun we'd already recovered. He also pointed out the location where they threw some guns over the fence.
Officer, do you mind going around checking?
We recovered two separate weapons from that, one which we believed was possibly the murder weapon.
With the likely murder weapon in hand, Kenda returns to the station, now fairly certain the cooperative, cool-headed Damien Nicholas has been feeding him a pack of lies.
It's about time you start telling us the truth. What do you mean? The truth, not that same bull story you already gave us.
And now we confront Damien.
That is the truth. That's what happened.
Damien denies everything, sticks to his initial story. We say, Damien, you're not listening. This is your friend, and he is naming you as the person responsible.
Your boy Alan gave you up.
In addition to naming you, he just sent our officers out with him to find the murder weapon, and they came back here with it. That's a big problem, don't you think, Damien?
It's in that moment that Damien's calm, collected demeanor comes crashing down.
Damien finally just breaks down and says, wait a minute.
Why is he ratting me out? I didn't shoot anybody. Alan shot somebody.
So now Alan's the one that did this?
Yes, Alan was the one who shot him.
Kenda's prime suspects have just turned on each other, and though Kenda suspects one of them murdered Robert Elshire, the question now is which one?
It's annoying that we have to play this game to get to the truth. I'm good at the game.
And you have some way you can back this up? You can prove this to us?
Kenda pushes Damien for details that might support his version of the story.
There's some gray pants.
You'll find a pair of pants at my girlfriend's house that Alan was wearing. You get them and bring them here, and you'll see that they don't fit me. I wasn't wearing them.
You can even try them on me. They're not mine. They're his.
Those are Alan's pants?
Yes.
Eyewitness Julie Canfield Shandy identified the shooter as wearing a pair of gray pants the night of the crime. If Damien is telling the truth, this could be the evidence Kenda has been looking for.
Okay, Damien. We'll be back.
As the sun begins to rise over Colorado Springs, Kenda's men pound on the front door of a nearby residence. A man answers the door.
Morning. What can I help you, sir? Colorado Springs detectives.
It's the father of Damien's girlfriend, Vita Mays.
Do you mind if we come in and talk to her? Of course, come in.
Her father is more distressed than she is. She's more interested in the standard juvenile code of silence. Never tell an adult the truth.
Do you know what Damien?
No. I don't know what you're talking about.
Damien, your boyfriend?
Refusing to play her game, Kenda peppers Vita with questions.
The reason we're here is because your boyfriend Damien and his friend Alan are in a lot of trouble.
Look, I don't know anything.
Eventually, Vita starts to crack.
Damien's your boyfriend, correct?
Yes.
And he was here last night.
Yeah, he came over.
Then you know his friend Alan Lucero. Well, yeah, I know Alan. Great, because they were here last night.
Tell me what happened.
Vida tells Kenda that she, Damien, and Alan all watched the movie at her place.
Did they leave at any point?
They went to go play basketball.
According to Vida, after the movie was over,
You ready to get out of here?
Yeah.
Damien and Alan left, but then returned a few hours later.
What happened when they came back?
They were really sweaty, and so they changed clothes.
At that point, Damien asked Vida to hold on to his gym bag. Then he and Alan headed back out into the night.
Is that bag here? Well, yeah, that black bag there on the floor, that's Damien's bag. Good.
Go ahead and open it.
We open the bag. There's a box of 25 auto ammunition. We're looking around the bag. There's a pair of gray pants. Whose pants are those? Those are Alan's.
Why did you leave them here?
Last night.
So these are the pants that he was wearing?
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
This gray pair of pants had some shell casings or live rounds, 25 caliber, in the pockets. Another piece of evidence that ties everything to our scene.
Detectives collect the evidence and deliver it to headquarters for processing, except for the gray pants. Kenda takes those back to the interrogation room where Alan Lucero is being held.
Recognize these, Alan? No.
And throws them at his suspect.
Try them out.
Right now? Yeah, right now. Put them on.
Lieutenant Joe Kenda is sitting in an interrogation room across from 17-year-old Alan Lucero. Lucero, along with his friend Damien Nicholas, are the prime suspects in the shooting death of 71-year-old marathon runner Robert Elshire. Both young men claim the other is responsible.
Why is he ratting me out? I didn't shoot anybody.
Now we have the ultimate problem. We have two perpetrators accusing each other.
Kenda's men have discovered a pair of gray pants that Damien and his girlfriend claim Alan Lucero was wearing the night of the murder. Pants that match a description of the shooter given by eyewitness Julie Canfield Shandy. Kenda decides to use this evidence as a chance to play hardball with Alan Lucero.
These aren't your pants?
I tell you what, Alan, try these on. And I threw them at him.
Try them out.
Right now? Yeah, right now. Put them on. He puts them on, they of course fit perfectly. It's amazing, isn't it, Alan?
With the gray pants, the discovery of the likely murder weapon, and Julie Canfield Shandy's eyewitness account, Kenda is ready to charge Alan Lucero with the murder of Robert Elshire.
We've got a very good circumstantial case against these people. I want it much tighter than that. I need a statement. Tell me you did this.
Unfortunately, Alan Lucero's age complicates the situation.
Alan is under 18, which means legally he is a child, which means his parents are required before we can take a legal statement.
Before we start, I need to inform you of your rights. You have the right to remain silent.
Alan's mother's in tears, so is his father. Not Alan, just the parents.
Alan's mother and father urge their son to tell the truth. Alan sticks to his original story.
I need you to tell me why you shot that man.
I didn't. Damien did.
Lucero, like all other kids his age, they present this attitude of they're bad guys and they're not afraid of the police, but in reality they are.
Kenda counts on this fear to get his confession.
Do you remember when you ran across the street and almost got hit by a car? And you stopped right in front of that car? Do you remember that, Alan? And he looks at us and he says,
Did she see my face?
Yeah, Alan, she saw your face. And you see it. He is cornered now. He's absolutely cornered.
I shot him.
When you finally get to the truth, it makes you feel very good.
Alan explains his family had recently fallen on hard financial times, and he committed the crime to help pay the bills and keep from being evicted. But at this point, Kenda's no longer concerned with the why so much as the how.
We asked Alan where he came by these weapons, and he said Damien had all three of them.
According to Alan, on the night of the murder, he asked Damien if he'd help him pull off an armed robbery.
You ready? Yeah, man. Let's go.
Damien agreed, and after leaving Vita May's house, they camped out in the drugstore parking lot, scoping out potential victims.
They actually had waited outside this drugstore, and nobody was coming out.
So Damien went to the other side of the street to wait, but I stayed there.
Moments later, Alan spotted Robert Elshire making his way toward the drugstore.
A guy came around and I tapped him on the shoulder. Hey, give me your money.
He took a swing at me, and I stepped back, and I said, I'm gonna shoot you, and I fired the gun. And he went down on the ground, and I screamed, I'm sorry, at the top of my lungs, and then I ran.
Alan Lucero claims he was so shaken by what he'd done that he forgot to actually steal Robert Elshire's wallet. Once safely across the street, Alan hooked back up with Damien Nicholas.
They have this cockamamie juvenile scheme of hiding the guns and changing clothes and stumbling around in this neighborhood until they get picked up by the police.
When Kenda confronts Damien with Alan's confession, he confirms the story. Both boys are charged as adults for first-degree murder.
Damien is a participant. He provides the weapons. He is a lookout at the time the incident occurs. In the law, eyes of the law, he's equally responsible.
Folks in Colorado Springs are shaken by this senseless crime. And when the Pikes Peak Marathon begins 2 days later, victim Robert Elshire is remembered by his fellow runners.
The race event coordinators decided that all of the runners in the race that day would wear a ribbon on their arm in memory of my dad.
The absolute most horrible part of this is Robert Elshire, a 71-year-old man who is in Colorado to run up a mountain because he likes to do it. And somebody takes his life for nothing.
The city never saw him arrive. It never watched him leave. There was no face pressed against a rain-soaked window, no mysterious stranger stepping off a train beneath the dim glow of station lamps, no whispered introduction carried through crowded streets. One day, New Orleans was simply living its ordinary life, and then, almost without warning, fear found a permanent address among its people. Long before anyone would call him the Axeman, before newspaper headlines transformed an invisible predator into a legend, the city belonged to music, commerce, and sleepless nights. Streetcars rattled through neighborhoods lined with weathered wooden houses. Grocery stores opened before sunrise, their owners sweeping sidewalks while the scent of fresh bread drifted into humid morning air. Children chased each other through narrow streets, paying little attention to conversations about war unfolding thousands of miles away across the Atlantic. Jazz was still young, still finding its heartbeat inside smoky dance halls where trumpets, clarinets, and pianos argued with one another until dawn. New Orleans had always carried two personalities. By daylight it welcomed merchants, dockworkers, fishermen, immigrants, and travelers from every direction. By night it became something altogether different. Shadows stretched longer beneath gas lamps. Alleyways disappeared into darkness thick enough to swallow footsteps. The Mississippi River flowed past the city with quiet confidence, carrying ships and secrets alike. Every neighborhood seemed to possess stories that refused to die, tales of ghosts wandering old cemeteries, strange lights drifting across the bayou, and voices heard from empty buildings after midnight. The people who lived there laughed at many of those stories. Until they couldn't. Fear rarely announces itself with a scream. More often, it arrives as uncertainty. A neighbor locks the door twice instead of once. Someone glances over a shoulder while walking home. Conversations pause whenever unfamiliar footsteps echo outside. No one remembers exactly when these habits begin. They simply become part of everyday life. That was how terror spread through New Orleans. Not like a storm crashing against the city in a single violent night, but like water slowly creeping beneath a door. The first whispers traveled faster than official reports ever could. They moved through barbershops, grocery counters, church pews, crowded cafes, and family dinner tables. Someone had heard about a terrible attack. Someone else insisted the victims had been butchered while sleeping. Another swore the killer had vanished without taking a single dollar from the house. Every version sounded worse than the last. Nobody knew which details were true. Everybody believed something terrible had happened. The city searched desperately for an explanation because explanations make horror easier to understand. Perhaps it was robbery gone wrong. Perhaps it was revenge. Perhaps organized crime had settled another score. New Orleans had seen violence before. Violence could be explained. What frightened people was the possibility that there was no explanation waiting at the end of the story. Imagine lying awake after midnight in a wooden house built decades earlier. The summer air hangs heavy inside every room. Windows are cracked open because the heat refuses to leave. Every sound carries farther than it should. A dog barks somewhere down the street. A train horn drifts across the river. Wood settles with soft creaks as old homes breathe through the night. Then comes silence. Not peaceful silence. The kind that makes every tiny noise impossible to ignore. A branch brushes against the roof. A floorboard sighs. Someone shifts beneath blankets. For just a moment, every homeowner begins wondering the same impossible question. Did I actually hear something? Or did I imagine it? By the time dawn arrived, those questions often disappeared beneath the practical demands of ordinary life. Stores had to open. Bread had to be baked. Deliveries had to be made. Children had to be fed. Bills waited for no one. Daily routines became temporary shields against growing anxiety. Yet every sunset stripped those shields away. The killer seemed to understand something fundamental about human nature. Night transforms familiar places into unfamiliar ones. Hallways become darker than they appeared during daylight. Windows become mirrors reflecting only the room behind them. Every closed door invites imagination to fill whatever waits beyond it. Whoever committed the murders exploited that transformation with terrifying precision. There were no dramatic confrontations in crowded streets. No public declarations. No warnings left behind. Only sleeping families. Only quiet homes. Only unimaginable violence waiting inside bedrooms where people believed they were safest. Centuries of civilization have taught humanity to fear strangers in lonely places. Forests, empty roads. Abandoned buildings. But home is different. Home is where children fall asleep without fear. Home is where parents promise everything will be all right. Home is where locks on doors symbolize protection. The invisible killer shattered that belief. Not by breaking windows. Not by forcing front doors open. But by slipping into the private spaces where trust itself lived. Years later, criminologists would study patterns. Historians would debate timelines. Writers would search for motives hidden inside incomplete police records. Theories would multiply with every passing decade. Some believed there had only been one murderer. Others argued several unrelated crimes had been stitched together by frightened newspapers hungry for sensational headlines. Suspects emerged, disappeared, and emerged again beneath different names. None of them answered the question that haunted New Orleans from the beginning. Who was walking through the city after everyone else had gone to sleep? Because someone was. Someone knew which neighborhoods offered darkness instead of witnesses. Someone understood how old wooden houses could be entered without attracting attention. Someone possessed enough confidence to stand inside another person's home while entire families slept only a few feet away. That realization terrified investigators almost as much as the killings themselves. Murder often leaves behind emotion. Rage stains a crime scene in ways detectives eventually recognize. Desperation has its own signature. So does panic. But these attacks seemed strangely detached, almost mechanical in their execution. The brutality was overwhelming, yet robbery rarely followed. Expensive belongings remained untouched. Money stayed where it had been left. Jewelry continued resting on dressers beside beds soaked in blood. If wealth wasn't the objective, what was? The absence of an answer became a character all its own. It haunted newspaper editors searching for tomorrow's front page. It haunted police officers walking into yet another blood-stained bedroom. It haunted families who found themselves checking every door and window before trying unsuccessfully to sleep. Most of all, it haunted those who wondered whether chance alone determined who lived until sunrise. The city itself seemed to change. Neighbors who once lingered outside after dinner now hurried indoors before darkness settled. Shopkeepers discussed stronger locks instead of business. Church congregations prayed not only for soldiers fighting overseas but for protection inside their own homes. Mothers insisted children come inside earlier than before. Fathers who had never considered keeping weapons nearby suddenly did. Fear has an extraordinary ability to reshape ordinary behavior. It asks nothing. It simply waits until people begin changing their lives on its behalf. What nobody realized was that the nightmare had barely begun. The murders that would eventually define one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries had not yet reached their most infamous chapter. There would be more victims. More shattered families. More impossible questions. There would be investigators chasing shadows through neighborhoods that seemed to grow quieter with every passing month. And eventually, there would be a letter. A letter so bizarre, so theatrical, and so unsettling that an entire city would alter its behavior because of words printed on a single sheet of paper. Before that letter, however, before jazz would become entwined with survival in one of the strangest episodes in American criminal history, there was only a city slowly realizing that evil did not always wear a recognizable face. Sometimes it left no fingerprints worth following. Sometimes it stole nothing. Sometimes it entered through the back door, borrowed a weapon already waiting inside the house, and disappeared before dawn as though it had never existed at all. When the first rays of morning sunlight reached the rooftops of New Orleans, people still believed daylight meant safety. They believed answers would come. They believed the police would eventually find the man responsible and restore a sense of order to streets that had quietly surrendered to uncertainty. They did not yet understand that they were standing at the beginning of a mystery that would outlive every detective assigned to solve it, every witness who claimed to have seen something in the darkness, and nearly everyone who had survived those terrifying nights. More than a century later, the identity of the Axeman remains hidden somewhere between fact, folklore, and fear. The case has survived because no final chapter was ever written. No confession closed the investigation. No courtroom delivered a verdict. What remains instead is a collection of blood-stained rooms, fractured lives, unanswered questions, and a city forever marked by the memory of footsteps no one could prove they had heard. And every great unsolved mystery begins the same way. With an ordinary night that no one realizes will be the last ordinary night they will ever know. New Orleans in 1918 was a city that seemed to breathe in two different rhythms at once. During the day, it moved with purpose. Horse-drawn wagons shared the streets with the growing number of automobiles. Dock workers shouted over the groan of steamships arriving from distant ports. Vendors displayed fresh seafood caught only hours earlier, while neighborhood grocers arranged baskets of vegetables beneath striped awnings already fading beneath the relentless Louisiana sun. Every corner carried the scent of something different. Fresh coffee roasted nearby. Warm bread cooled on wooden shelves. Salt from the Mississippi drifted through the humid air, mixing with coal smoke and the perfume of magnolia blossoms that somehow survived the city's constant motion. Yet beneath that vibrant surface lay a city balancing on uncertainty. The First World War had entered its final year, and although the battlefields were thousands of miles away, the conflict reached New Orleans in quieter ways. Young men disappeared from familiar streets, leaving behind empty chairs at dinner tables and anxious mothers who measured time by letters arriving from Europe. Newspapers devoted entire pages to casualty reports while businesses struggled to replace workers who had enlisted. Every train station became a place of both hope and heartbreak, where departures carried patriotic speeches but arrivals often brought devastating telegrams instead. As if war were not enough, another invisible enemy had begun its approach. The influenza pandemic that would later become known as the Spanish flu was spreading across the globe. Rumors of entire communities falling ill traveled almost as quickly as the disease itself. Doctors argued over treatments they barely understood. Churches prayed for protection against an illness no one could see. People covered coughs with handkerchiefs while secretly wondering whether the stranger standing beside them carried death in a single breath. Fear had already become part of daily life before the murders ever began. But this fear was different. Disease belonged to nature. War belonged to politics. The violence that was about to unfold belonged to one human being. Or perhaps more than one. No one knew. The neighborhoods where many of the future victims lived were tightly connected communities, especially among immigrant families who had arrived from Sicily and southern Italy decades earlier. They had crossed the Atlantic carrying little more than hope and determination, building small grocery stores that became the heartbeat of their neighborhoods. These stores were more than businesses. They were gathering places where customers exchanged recipes, neighborhood gossip, news from overseas, and advice about raising children in a country that still viewed many immigrants with suspicion. Long before supermarkets existed, the neighborhood grocer knew almost everyone by name. He extended credit when families struggled. He remembered birthdays. He listened to worries. He became part merchant, part banker, part friend. Many of these families worked from before sunrise until late into the evening. After closing their stores, they counted the day's earnings, swept the floors, extinguished the lamps, and walked only a few steps into the living quarters connected to the business or located nearby. Life was demanding, but it was predictable. Hard work promised stability. Stability promised a better future for their children. That promise made what happened later feel even more cruel. The houses themselves reflected another era. Most were built from wood, elevated slightly above the damp ground to protect against flooding. Narrow hallways connected modest bedrooms. Thin walls carried sound surprisingly well. A crying infant could be heard from the next room. So could footsteps in the hallway. Doors were often secured with simple locks that offered peace of mind but little genuine protection against someone determined to enter. Air conditioning did not exist. Summer nights forced families to leave windows partially open despite the risks. Ceiling fans turned lazily above sleeping couples while mosquitoes drifted through torn screens. Outside, gas lamps illuminated only small circles of light, leaving much of every street swallowed by darkness. Electricity had reached many parts of the city, but it had not conquered the night. Darkness still ruled after midnight. Police work in 1918 looked very different from what modern audiences might imagine. Crime scene tape did not exist. DNA analysis would remain impossible for generations. Fingerprint science was still developing and rarely provided decisive answers. Detectives depended heavily on witness testimony, handwritten notes, intuition, and luck. A single rainstorm could erase footprints. A curious neighbor might unknowingly destroy evidence before investigators even arrived. Journalists often reached crime scenes almost as quickly as the police themselves, gathering details that spread across breakfast tables the following morning. Newspapers competed fiercely for readers, and sensational headlines sold copies. Facts mixed freely with speculation. Rumors became accepted truths simply because they appeared in print. In that environment, separating reality from exaggeration would become one of the greatest challenges facing everyone involved. New Orleans also carried complicated social tensions. Anti-immigrant prejudice lingered beneath the surface. Sicilian families, despite years of honest work, were frequently viewed with suspicion by segments of society. Organized crime existed in the public imagination, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes rooted in reality. Whenever violence touched an Italian neighborhood, whispers of secret feuds or criminal organizations emerged almost automatically, regardless of whether evidence supported such theories. Those assumptions would influence the investigation in ways that are still debated today. Meanwhile, ordinary evenings continued much as they always had. Children finished homework beneath kerosene lamps. Mothers folded freshly washed clothes while listening to distant piano music drifting through open windows. Fathers discussed rising prices, war news, and neighborhood business with friends before heading home. Street musicians performed outside crowded restaurants where laughter spilled onto sidewalks well after sunset. If anyone had walked through those neighborhoods in the spring of 1918, nothing would have appeared unusual. The city did not look like a place waiting for one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. It looked like home. That illusion would not last. Somewhere beyond the glow of storefront windows, beyond the music rising from dance halls, beyond conversations that stretched late into warm Louisiana evenings, someone was already learning the city's hidden geography. Someone understood which homes stood isolated enough to avoid unwanted attention. Someone recognized how older wooden buildings could be entered quietly. Whether these observations came from careful planning or simple familiarity remains unknown. History offers almost no glimpse into those unseen moments. There is no diary revealing motive. No confession explaining intent. Only the terrible certainty that preparation had already begun before anyone realized they were in danger. The city slept peacefully because it believed tomorrow would resemble yesterday. Tomorrow had other plans. For most of history, the names of ordinary people disappear with time. They belong to families, to neighborhoods, to small circles of friends, and eventually they fade into old photographs and fading memories. Their routines are never recorded. Their conversations vanish the moment they are spoken. Their dreams remain known only to the people who loved them. Then tragedy arrives. Suddenly, a name that once appeared only in church records, grocery ledgers, or family letters becomes part of history forever. The victims of the Axeman were never supposed to be remembered as victims. They were supposed to be remembered as parents, spouses, neighbors, business owners, and friends. Long before newspaper headlines reduced their lives to a few shocking paragraphs, they belonged to a city that depended on people exactly like them. Joseph Maggio was one of those people. If someone had walked into his grocery store on an ordinary spring afternoon in 1918, they would not have seen a man destined to become the first widely recognized victim of one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. They would have seen a hard-working shopkeeper greeting familiar customers by name while weighing vegetables on a brass scale polished by years of use. Wooden shelves stood neatly stocked with flour, canned goods, dried beans, spices, and fresh produce delivered before sunrise. The smell of coffee beans mingled with cured meats hanging nearby, creating the familiar scent that greeted every customer before a single word was exchanged. Small neighborhood grocery stores were not simply places where people bought food. They were the center of community life. Neighbors lingered long after making their purchases, discussing local news, rising prices, children, church events, and the latest reports arriving from Europe. Business and friendship often became impossible to separate. Joseph understood that. Like many Sicilian immigrants who had come to America searching for opportunity, he knew success would never come easily. Every dollar represented another hour of work. Every satisfied customer increased the chance that the business would survive another difficult year. Long days were accepted without complaint because they promised something larger than immediate comfort. A future. Beside him stood his wife, Catherine. The two shared far more than ownership of a grocery store. They shared the quiet rhythm of everyday life that develops between two people after years of marriage. Small gestures replaced unnecessary conversation. One glance across the room could communicate everything from exhaustion to amusement. They worked side by side through long hours, knowing exactly when the other needed help without having to ask. When evening finally arrived, the couple would close the store, count the day's earnings, secure the doors, and retreat into the privacy of their home. Like countless married couples across New Orleans, they believed the hardest part of the day had ended. Sleep represented safety. It was earned through honest labor. Only history knows how cruel that assumption would become. Not far away, another grocery owner lived a life built upon similar routines. Louis Bissouma had established himself through determination rather than luck. Owning a neighborhood business demanded discipline. Deliveries arrived before dawn. Inventory had to be managed carefully because wasted food meant wasted money. Customers expected familiar faces behind the counter, even on days when exhaustion made every movement feel heavier than the last. Those who knew him described an ordinary working man rather than someone surrounded by mystery. Yet history would remember him for entirely different reasons. Harriet Lowe entered his life under circumstances that later attracted enormous public attention. Newspapers questioned the nature of their relationship. Rumors spread with remarkable speed, as rumors often do when tragedy leaves unanswered questions behind. Some reports described her as a housekeeper. Others suggested something more personal connected the two. Whatever the truth may have been, one fact remains certain. They were human beings before they became subjects of speculation. Like everyone else in the city, they lived beneath the illusion that walls and locked doors separated ordinary families from extraordinary violence. Anna Schneider represented another face of New Orleans entirely. She was expecting a child. In any era, pregnancy transforms the future into something tangible. Every decision becomes connected to someone who has not yet entered the world. Families begin preparing rooms, choosing names, imagining birthdays that have not yet arrived. Anna carried those hopes through the humid summer of 1918. Neighbors likely noticed the careful way she moved as her pregnancy advanced. Simple household tasks required greater effort. Rest became more valuable than ever. Every kick from the baby served as a reassuring reminder that another life continued growing beneath her heart. Her greatest concern should have been childbirth. Instead, history forced her into an entirely different struggle. Remarkably, despite the unimaginable violence she would later endure, both she and her child survived. That survival became one of the rare moments of hope inside an otherwise relentless story. Months later, another family would unknowingly find themselves standing at the edge of unimaginable loss. Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia had built a life centered around work and family. Their grocery store demanded the same exhausting schedule shared by so many immigrant households throughout New Orleans. Every morning began before sunrise. Every evening ended only after the final customer had left. Yet their greatest source of happiness waited at home. Their infant daughter, Mary. For parents, the arrival of a child changes the meaning of ordinary moments. A quiet evening becomes precious because it is shared together. A baby's smile outweighs an exhausting day of labor. Every plan for the future gradually begins revolving around someone too young to understand the sacrifices already being made on her behalf. Mary had barely begun her life. She would never have the opportunity to grow old enough to remember the city in which she was born. Her name would forever remain frozen in infancy. Perhaps no detail of the Axeman case continues to haunt readers more than the presence of children inside homes transformed into crime scenes. Violence against adults shocks society. Violence against infants wounds something even deeper. It challenges the belief that innocence offers protection. It never does. Sarah Laumann lived alone. That fact distinguished her from several of the other victims. Living independently in the early 20th century required resilience, particularly for a woman. Daily responsibilities belonged entirely to her. Every decision regarding safety rested on her own judgment. Her apartment represented independence as much as shelter. She survived. But survival carried its own burden. Traumatic brain injuries often steal memories along with certainty. When investigators searched desperately for answers, Sarah could offer almost none. The face of the person responsible disappeared behind the fog created by overwhelming violence. The witness everyone hoped might identify the killer instead became another reminder of how thoroughly the attacks erased certainty. Then there was Mike Pepitone. By the autumn of 1919, New Orleans had already spent more than a year living beneath the shadow of fear. Every new attack deepened public anxiety. Every newspaper headline reminded families that the killer remained free. Mike was known as another hard-working member of the city's Italian-American community. Like others before him, his days revolved around responsibility rather than adventure. Work came first. Family came first. Ordinary ambitions. Ordinary routines. Ordinary life. Nothing about him suggested he would become associated with what many historians consider the final recognized attack attributed to the mysterious killer. Yet history rarely asks permission before rewriting someone's story. One of the striking patterns connecting so many victims lies not in who they were individually, but in what they represented collectively. None were wealthy public figures. None possessed extraordinary political influence. None lived inside lavish mansions protected by private security. They represented the backbone of a working city. Shopkeepers. Families. Neighbors. People whose greatest daily concern involved earning enough money, caring for loved ones, and hoping tomorrow would be slightly better than today. Perhaps that is one reason the case continues to resonate more than a century later. The victims feel familiar. Even now. Walk through almost any neighborhood in the world today and you will still find people who resemble them. Someone opens a family-owned store before sunrise. Someone prepares dinner while waiting for a spouse to return home. Someone rocks a newborn to sleep after another exhausting day. Someone counts the cash register before locking the front door for the night. History changes. Human routines rarely do. That familiarity makes the coming violence feel disturbingly close. The Axeman did not target castles or isolated estates hidden beyond civilization. The attacks happened inside homes that looked remarkably ordinary. Homes where laundry waited to be folded. Homes where dishes remained in kitchen sinks after supper. Homes where tomorrow's breakfast ingredients already rested inside cupboards. Homes filled with lives still in progress. When people remember infamous killers, public fascination often drifts toward the mystery surrounding the perpetrator. Countless books debate motives, suspects, and psychological profiles. Endless documentaries attempt to identify the unseen face lurking behind the legend. But every mystery begins by taking something from someone else. Behind every unsolved case stands a family that never received an explanation. Parents buried children. Children buried parents. Spouses returned to bedrooms that would never again feel safe. Entire neighborhoods learned that grief could arrive without warning and remain for generations. Before investigators examined bloodstains. Before reporters printed dramatic headlines. Before strangers argued over theories more than a century later. There were simply families waiting for loved ones to wake up. Morning came. They never did. The night of May 22, 1918, began like countless other nights in New Orleans. There was nothing in the air to suggest that history was about to change. No warning carried through the streets. No stranger stood beneath a street lamp announcing his intentions. No sound of approaching danger disturbed the ordinary rhythm of the neighborhood. The city simply continued breathing. Families finished their dinners. Store owners counted their earnings. Children were sent to bed. Lamps were extinguished one by one as people prepared for another morning of work. In neighborhoods where many Italian immigrant families lived, the day usually ended with the same familiar rituals. The front of a small grocery store would be cleaned. Wooden counters would be wiped down. Shelves would be checked one final time. Doors would be locked, not because anyone expected danger, but because closing a business was simply part of the routine. For Joseph and Catherine Maggio, that evening should have been another ordinary chapter in their lives. Their grocery store had been a symbol of everything they had worked to build. Like many immigrant families who arrived in America searching for stability, they had created their future one exhausting day at a time. Their world was not defined by luxury or wealth. It was defined by persistence. A customer entering their store knew what they would find. A familiar face behind the counter. A place where neighbors exchanged conversation. A small piece of security in an unpredictable world. By the time night settled over New Orleans, Joseph and Catherine were inside their home, away from the demands of business. The sounds of the neighborhood gradually faded. The streets became quieter. The activities of the day surrendered to darkness. They went to sleep believing that morning would arrive as it always had. It would not. The attack that followed would become the first crime widely connected to the figure later known as the Axeman of New Orleans. The details surrounding that night remain disturbing not only because of what happened, but because of the questions that have remained unanswered for more than a century. Who entered the home? How long had that person been watching? Was this a crime chosen randomly, or had the victims been deliberately selected? The answers disappeared with the person responsible. What investigators eventually discovered was that the attacker had not simply forced his way through the front entrance. The method suggested planning and familiarity with the vulnerability of older New Orleans homes. A panel of wood near the rear entrance had been damaged, creating an opening large enough for someone to enter. This detail would become one of the most terrifying patterns associated with the later attacks. The killer did not announce himself. He did not break through the obvious barrier where people expected danger. He found another way. A hidden way. A way that transformed the safety of a home into an illusion. Inside, Joseph and Catherine were asleep. The house that had protected them from storms, heat, and the challenges of daily life offered no protection against the person who had entered during the quietest hours of the night. The attack was brutal. Investigators later determined that both victims had suffered severe wounds. A razor was believed to have been used in the assault, and an axe became the weapon associated with the crime. The attacker appeared to have used objects available inside the home rather than bringing a distinctive weapon that could easily identify him. That detail created another disturbing question. Had the killer entered already knowing what he would do? Or had he simply taken advantage of whatever was available? The answer was impossible to recover. What investigators could establish was that the crime did not appear motivated by theft. Money remained. Valuable possessions were left behind. The attacker had entered the home, committed violence, and disappeared. Nothing material had been taken. Only lives. When the victims were discovered, the horror of the scene shocked those who arrived afterward. A familiar home had been transformed into something unrecognizable. The place where a family should have felt safest had become the center of an investigation. Neighbors gathered outside, drawn by confusion and fear. In communities where everyone knew one another's routines, tragedy rarely remained private for long. People came not because they wanted to witness suffering, but because they could not understand how such violence had reached their own streets. The questions began almost immediately. Who would do this? Why them? Could the killer strike again? At first, investigators faced the same problem that would follow the case for months. They had a crime. But they did not have a clear motive. The absence of robbery complicated everything. If money was not the goal, what had brought the attacker there? Personal revenge? A hidden conflict? A random act of violence? Every possibility created more uncertainty. In the days that followed, newspapers reported the details with increasing alarm. The public wanted answers, and newspapers wanted stories that captured attention. The shocking nature of the attack ensured that the case quickly moved beyond the immediate neighborhood. New Orleans had experienced violence before. But this felt different. A person had entered a private home during the most vulnerable moment imaginable. Sleep. The idea alone disturbed people. A locked door no longer represented complete safety. A quiet street no longer represented peace. Every family member who turned off a light that night carried the same uncomfortable thought. Could it happen here? The Maggio case marked the beginning of a nightmare that would eventually spread far beyond one household. At the time, however, no one knew they were witnessing the first chapter of something larger. Police did not yet know they were searching for a serial offender. The public did not yet know the name Axeman. There was only a single violent attack and a city trying to understand what had happened. But hidden within the details of that crime were clues that would later appear again. The nighttime intrusion. The damaged rear entrance. The use of weapons found inside the victim's own home. The absence of theft. The sudden disappearance of the attacker. A pattern was beginning to form. But patterns are often invisible when viewed one event at a time. For the investigators standing inside the Maggio home, there was no way to know whether they were looking at an isolated tragedy or the beginning of a series of crimes that would haunt New Orleans for generations. They searched for evidence. They questioned people. They followed possibilities. But the person responsible had already vanished into the city. The streets outside continued as they always had. Streetcars continued moving. Businesses continued opening. Neighbors continued greeting one another. Life continued. But something had changed. A shadow had entered New Orleans. And it would not leave quietly. The attack on Joseph and Catherine Maggio would become the first major step in a terrifying sequence of events. In the months ahead, other families would experience the same impossible fear. Other homes would become crime scenes. Other victims would wake up to the same nightmare that had begun in the early hours of May 23, 1918. And with each new attack, one question would grow louder. Who was the person walking through the darkness of New Orleans after midnight? For now, the answer remained hidden. The city had only just begun to search. After the deaths of Joseph and Catherine Maggio, New Orleans entered a new and unfamiliar reality. At first, many people hoped the tragedy was an isolated act of violence. A terrible crime, yes, but one with a beginning and an end. Cities often cling to that belief after shocking events. The idea that something horrific can happen once is frightening enough. The possibility that it can happen again is almost impossible to accept. But the fear created by the Maggio murders did not disappear with the passing days. It remained. It lingered in conversations held quietly behind closed doors. It followed people walking home after dark. It appeared in the extra seconds someone spent checking a lock before going to bed. The attack had created a new awareness among residents. Danger did not always come from the streets. Sometimes it entered from behind. And then, more than a month later, the nightmare returned. On June 27, 1918, another home became the center of a violent attack. The victims were Louis Bissouma and Harriet Lowe. Unlike the Maggio case, this time the victims survived the initial assault, creating a rare opportunity for investigators. A living victim meant questions could be asked. Memories could be collected. Details could potentially lead authorities toward the person responsible. But survival did not mean clarity. In many ways, the Bissouma and Lowe case created even more confusion. The attack occurred during the early morning hours, when the outside world was still largely unaware of what was happening behind closed doors. The darkness that had protected the attacker before remained his greatest advantage. Once again, the method carried similarities to the earlier crime. The attacker entered the home without creating a dramatic disturbance. The violence appeared sudden and overwhelming. The weapon associated with the assault was again an axe, reinforcing the growing fear that the city might be facing a repeated pattern rather than a single act of violence. The idea that one person could be responsible for multiple attacks was difficult for many people to accept. Serial murder was not a concept widely understood by the public in 1918. Modern criminal profiling did not exist. There were no behavioral analysts studying patterns between crime scenes. There were no databases connecting similar offenses across neighborhoods. Investigators relied on experience, instinct, and physical evidence that was often incomplete. A connection that seems obvious today could remain hidden in plain sight at the time. Inside the Bissouma residence, investigators searched for answers. They examined the scene. They questioned the victims. They attempted to reconstruct the moments before the attack. But every answer seemed to create another question. Why had the attacker chosen this home? Why had the violence continued? Why had nothing valuable been taken? The lack of theft remained one of the most troubling details. A burglar entering a home would normally seek money, jewelry, or anything that could be quickly sold. But the person responsible for these attacks seemed interested in something else entirely. The crime itself appeared to be the purpose. That possibility terrified investigators because it removed the comforting logic of ordinary criminal behavior. If someone steals, people understand the motive. If someone seeks revenge, investigators search for enemies. If someone acts out of desperation, they look for circumstances. But what explanation exists when violence appears to exist without a clear reason? The absence of motive created a vacuum. And fear rushed in to fill it. The surviving victims became central figures in the investigation. Their accounts were carefully examined, but the trauma of the attack made certainty difficult. Memory under extreme stress is complicated. A moment of terror can become fragmented, with details appearing sharp in one instant and completely unreachable in another. Investigators needed facts. The victims had experienced horror. The two realities did not always align. Meanwhile, newspapers continued following the case closely. Public interest grew with every new detail. The idea that an unknown attacker could move through New Orleans at night, enter homes, and disappear afterward captured the imagination of a city already familiar with mystery and folklore. The killer was no longer just a criminal. He was becoming a symbol. A symbol of vulnerability. A symbol of the fear waiting beyond the edge of ordinary life. Yet while the public searched for explanations, another tragedy was approaching. On August 5, 1918, the pattern continued. This time, the victim was Anna Schneider. Her story added another layer of horror because she was not only fighting for her own life. She was carrying another life inside her. At 8 months pregnant, Anna should have been preparing for the arrival of her child. Her attention should have been focused on the future, the first moments after birth, the face of her newborn, the new responsibilities waiting ahead. Instead, she became another victim of an attacker who appeared to choose sleeping victims inside their own homes. The assault against Anna was severe. She suffered blows to the head but remarkably survived. Her survival became one of the few moments of relief in a case increasingly defined by loss. The child was later born safely. For a brief moment, the story offered something the others could not. A continuation. A reminder that the violence had not destroyed everything. But even survival came with a price. Anna's experience represented the psychological damage that extended beyond physical injuries. Living through such an attack meant carrying the memory of a moment when the world changed forever. The home that should have represented comfort had become the location of terror. The place where someone should have felt protected became the place where safety disappeared. That was one of the most powerful weapons the attacker possessed. Not simply the physical harm inflicted upon victims, but the fear left behind among everyone who heard their stories. By the summer of 1918, New Orleans residents were no longer asking whether the Maggio murders had been a tragic exception. They were asking whether the city had a predator among them. The similarities were becoming harder to ignore. The nighttime attacks. The vulnerable victims. The use of an axe. The mysterious entrance. The disappearance afterward. The police faced enormous pressure. Every new crime increased public anger. Every unanswered question damaged confidence. Residents wanted protection, but protection required knowing what they were protecting themselves from. And nobody could provide that answer. The attacker had no known identity. No confirmed motive. No clear connection to his victims. He existed only through the aftermath he left behind. The investigation was moving forward, but the truth remained distant. In the shadows of New Orleans, a pattern was forming. The city had not yet reached the darkest moment of the case. The most shocking attack was still ahead. The attack that would place the Axeman's name permanently into American crime history. The attack that would involve not just adults, but a family and an infant. The attack that would transform fear into panic. Because by early 1919, the people of New Orleans would discover that the person haunting their streets was not finished. And when the city finally heard the voice of the person calling himself the Axeman, it would be through a message unlike anything investigators had ever encountered. A letter promising death. A letter that would turn an entire city into a stage. A letter that would connect murder, fear, and jazz in one of the strangest episodes in criminal history. But before that happened, another family would open their home to the night. And they would never know that someone was coming. By the beginning of 1919, New Orleans had spent months living beneath an uncomfortable uncertainty. The attacks had created something more powerful than fear alone. They had created anticipation. Fear is the reaction to something that has already happened. Anticipation is the terror of waiting for what might happen next. Every night carried the same unanswered question. Would tomorrow's newspaper reveal another name? Would another family wake up to discover that their home had become a crime scene? Would the person responsible ever be found? For many residents, the answer seemed increasingly hopeless. The attacks had not followed the pattern of ordinary crime. There was no obvious target, no clear reason, no simple explanation that could restore a sense of order. The victims were not connected by a known personal conflict. They were not all wealthy. They were not all involved in the same business. They were ordinary people who had one terrible thing in common. They were vulnerable. They were asleep. They were at home. And someone had found a way to reach them. By March 1919, the city had already learned that the attacker seemed to favor quiet hours, when families were least prepared to defend themselves. The darkness of night had become associated with uncertainty. A locked door was no longer a guarantee. A familiar neighborhood no longer felt completely familiar. Then came the attack that would become one of the most haunting chapters of the entire case. The victims were Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia. And with them was their infant daughter, Mary. The Cortimiglia family represented everything the attacker appeared to threaten. A home. A marriage. A child. A future. Like many immigrant families in New Orleans, Charles and Rosie had worked hard to create stability. Their lives were built around the simple hopes shared by countless families, earning enough money, caring for their child, and building something that could be passed down to the next generation. Their daughter Mary was only a baby. She had not experienced the world beyond her parents' home. She knew nothing about fear, violence, or the dangers that adults spend their lives trying to protect children from. For her parents, every day revolved around keeping her safe. That is what makes the events of March 10, 1919, so difficult to comprehend. The attack occurred inside a place where a family should have been most protected. Their own home. As with earlier cases connected to the Axeman, investigators believed the attacker entered through a rear section of the house. Again, the method suggested someone who understood how to move quietly and avoid immediate detection. The person responsible did not need to create chaos before entering. The chaos came afterward. Inside the home, the attack unfolded while the family was asleep. The violence was severe. Charles and Rosie suffered serious injuries. Their infant daughter Mary did not survive. Her death became one of the most emotionally devastating moments of the entire case, not only for the Cortimiglia family but for the entire city. Newspapers reported the tragedy with horror. Neighbors struggled to understand how anyone could commit such violence against a baby. The crime changed the atmosphere of New Orleans. Before this attack, residents had feared becoming victims. After this attack, many felt something deeper. They felt that innocence itself had been violated. A city can endure many things. It can endure economic hardship. It can endure political uncertainty. It can endure the anxiety of war. But when violence reaches children, the emotional response becomes different. It touches a part of society that exists beyond ordinary fear. People no longer wondered only about protecting themselves. They wondered how to protect their families. Parents looked at their sleeping children differently. Every sound during the night carried more meaning. Every unexpected noise near a window or door became impossible to ignore. The Cortimiglia attack also intensified pressure on law enforcement. The public wanted action. They wanted arrests. They wanted someone responsible. But investigators faced the same obstacle that had followed the case from the beginning. The attacker left behind questions rather than answers. There was evidence of what happened. But not enough evidence to identify who did it. The crime scene could describe the violence. It could suggest a pattern. It could reveal the method. But it could not reveal the face behind the crime. And without a face, without a name, without a confession, the investigation remained trapped in uncertainty. The tragedy also highlighted another difficult reality of early 20th century investigations. Detectives were working without many of the tools considered essential today. There was no DNA testing. No digital records. No modern databases connecting crimes across jurisdictions. Evidence depended heavily on physical objects, eyewitness accounts, and the ability of investigators to recognize connections before those connections disappeared. In a case defined by darkness, uncertainty, and limited information, every missing detail mattered. The Cortimiglia attack became a turning point. The city was no longer dealing with rumors about a dangerous person. It was dealing with a confirmed pattern of violence that had continued for nearly a year. The attacker had survived every previous investigation. He had remained unidentified. He had moved through New Orleans without being captured. And now, after the death of a child, public fear reached a new level. But strangely, this was also the moment when the Axeman's legend began to transform. The attacker was no longer only a hidden figure moving through the night. Soon, he would become something even more unusual. A criminal who communicated. A killer who wanted attention. A person who would send a message directly to the city he had terrified. That message would contain threats, arrogance, and a bizarre condition that seemed almost impossible to believe. The city would learn that the man they feared was not only capable of violence. He wanted to be heard. But before that infamous letter arrived, there were still more victims. More homes. More nights filled with uncertainty. On September 3, 1919, Sarah Laumann became another name connected to the mystery. Her attack followed the same terrifying pattern. A person alone. A quiet home. A sudden assault. Sarah was found unconscious after suffering severe injuries. Unlike some previous victims, she survived, but the attack left her unable to provide investigators with the answers they desperately needed. The person who attacked her had taken away more than physical safety. He had taken away memory. And memory was one of the few weapons investigators had. Without a clear description of the attacker, detectives were forced back into speculation. They returned to old questions. Was the attacker targeting specific people? Was there a personal motive? Was the Axeman a single person at all? The possibility that different crimes had been connected incorrectly remained part of the discussion. Yet the public did not care about uncertainty. To them, the details looked connected. The method. The weapon. The fear. The timing. The city believed there was one person moving through the darkness. And that belief created a legend. The final recognized attack associated with the Axeman came on October 27, 1919. The victim was Mike Pepitone. By then, New Orleans had lived with the fear for so long that another attack felt almost inevitable. People had waited months hoping the nightmare would end. Instead, it continued. Pepitone was attacked inside his home, in the same private space where every person expects protection. His death marked what many historians consider the final known attack attributed to the Axeman. But even then, there was no satisfying conclusion. No arrest. No confession. No courtroom. No moment when the city could finally say, "This is the person responsible." Instead, the story ended with a question mark. The attacks stopped. The killer disappeared. But the mystery remained. And perhaps that is what made the Axeman of New Orleans different from many other criminals in history. A captured killer becomes a person. A name. A face. A final chapter. An unidentified killer becomes something else. A shadow. A possibility. A story that refuses to end. The victims, however, were never mysteries. They were real people. They had families. They had dreams. They had ordinary days before extraordinary tragedy interrupted their lives. The Axeman became famous because he remained unknown. But the people he hurt deserved to be remembered because they were known by those who loved them. Long before their names appeared in newspapers, they were husbands, wives, parents, and neighbors. They were lives interrupted. And behind every unanswered question surrounding the Axeman stands the same truth. The greatest tragedy of the case was never the mystery of who he was. It was the certainty of what he took away. In the aftermath of every violent crime, there is a moment when the world divides into two different realities. Before and after. Before the discovery, a home is simply a home. A place where people eat meals, rest after long days, and believe the walls around them offer protection. A bedroom is a private space. A locked door is a symbol of security. A quiet street is a sign that everything is normal. After the discovery, none of those things remain the same. The house becomes evidence. The bedroom becomes a crime scene. The silence becomes something people remember forever. For the victims of the Axeman of New Orleans, the discovery of each attack began with confusion before it became horror. There was rarely a dramatic moment when the truth announced itself. Instead, there were small details that felt wrong. A door that should have been closed. A person who did not answer. A room that seemed too quiet. Then came the realization. Something terrible had happened. The first major discovery connected to the Axeman case began with the Maggio family in May 1918. The morning after the attack, New Orleans woke as it always did. The city moved forward. Street vendors prepared for another day. Workers headed toward businesses and docks. Children walked through neighborhoods carrying books and talking about ordinary things. But inside the Maggio home, time had stopped. The discovery of Joseph and Catherine's bodies immediately transformed a private tragedy into a public crisis. Neighbors who had known the couple through their grocery business suddenly found themselves standing outside their home, trying to understand how such violence could have taken place in their own community. The details that emerged from the scene created more questions than answers. The victims had not been robbed. Their belongings remained. The attacker had not searched the house for valuables or escaped with anything that could explain the crime. The purpose seemed to have been violence itself. For investigators, that was one of the most troubling aspects. A crime motivated by profit usually leaves behind a recognizable pattern. A thief takes something. A robber demands something. A person seeking revenge often has a connection to the victim. But this crime seemed to exist outside those familiar categories. The investigators were left looking at a scene where the most important piece of evidence was also the thing they could not find. The person responsible. As detectives examined the home, another detail stood out. The method of entry. The attacker appeared to have entered through a rear portion of the building, damaging a wooden panel to create access. It was not the dramatic entrance people imagined when thinking about violent criminals. There was no shattered front door. No obvious confrontation with neighbors. No warning. The attacker had chosen the quietest path. That decision would later become one of the defining characteristics of the Axeman cases. The rear entrance. The hidden approach. The ability to move through darkness unnoticed. At the time, however, investigators did not yet know they were seeing the beginning of a pattern. They were simply trying to understand one terrible night. The same uncertainty followed the investigation into Louis Bissouma and Harriet Lowe. Unlike the Maggio case, the discovery did not reveal two people who had already lost their lives. Instead, investigators found survivors struggling to explain what had happened to them. Their injuries provided evidence that the attack had been violent and deliberate. But surviving a crime does not always mean remembering it clearly. Trauma can distort time. It can erase details. It can leave a person knowing something happened while being unable to reconstruct exactly how it happened. For detectives, this created a difficult situation. They needed information from the people who had experienced the attack. But those same people had been placed under unimaginable stress. Every question carried emotional weight. Every answer had to be carefully considered. The investigators were not simply searching for facts. They were trying to rebuild a night that had been shattered by violence. The discovery process repeated itself again with Anna Schneider. Her survival provided investigators with another opportunity to understand the attacker's methods. Yet even with a living victim, the central mystery remained. Who was he? What did he look like? Why had he chosen her? The physical evidence could describe the attack. It could not reveal the intention behind it. This became the central frustration of the entire case. The scenes contained pieces of a puzzle. But the most important piece was always missing. The identity of the person who created them. By the time investigators reached the Cortimiglia crime scene in March 1919, the emotional impact was even greater. The presence of a baby among the victims changed everything. The public reaction was immediate. People who had previously followed the case from a distance now felt personally threatened. The attack was no longer just something happening to another family in another neighborhood. It was a reminder that no household seemed completely safe. The discovery of the Cortimiglia scene also intensified media attention. Reporters searched for every available detail. Readers wanted explanations. They wanted a name. They wanted to believe that someone capable of such violence could be identified and stopped. But the investigation remained trapped. The same questions returned. Was there a connection between the victims? Was the attacker choosing targets deliberately? Was there a hidden motive? Or was the city dealing with someone who selected victims simply because they were available? Without answers, theories multiplied. Some focused on personal revenge. Others suggested criminal conflicts. Some believed the victims' backgrounds played a role. And some questioned whether all the attacks were truly connected. This uncertainty complicated the investigation. A pattern can be powerful, but it can also become dangerous if investigators force unrelated events into the same explanation. Every similarity had to be examined carefully. Was the same person responsible? Or was fear causing the city to connect crimes that only looked alike? That question would remain throughout the case. The attack on Sarah Laumann created another challenge. Because she survived but had limited memory of the event, investigators once again faced the problem of missing information. The crime scene could tell them what had happened physically. It could not tell them what the attacker was thinking. That absence of motive became one of the defining mysteries of the Axeman investigation. Many criminals leave behind traces of themselves. A message. A signature. A demand. An explanation. The Axeman left behind uncertainty. And uncertainty can be more frightening than almost anything else. Because people can prepare for a known threat. They can lock doors. They can avoid certain places. They can understand a pattern. But an unknown threat forces people to imagine every possibility. Every stranger becomes suspicious. Every unusual sound becomes meaningful. Every shadow becomes a question. By late 1919, the people of New Orleans were exhausted. The city had spent months searching for answers that never arrived. Police had examined evidence, followed leads, questioned suspects, and attempted to connect pieces of information that seemed determined to remain incomplete. The investigation had produced theories. It had produced fear. It had produced headlines. But it had not produced justice. The person responsible remained free. And somewhere beneath the uncertainty, investigators knew one thing. The attacks had not been random accidents. Someone had entered those homes. Someone had moved through those rooms. Someone had left families destroyed and walked away. The discovery of each crime scene told a story. But it was only half a story. The victim's suffering was visible. The attacker's identity remained hidden. And that mystery would become the greatest challenge facing investigators as they entered the next stage of the case. The search for the Axeman had begun. But finding him would prove far more difficult than anyone imagined. The most difficult crime scenes are not always the ones filled with the most evidence. Sometimes, they are the ones filled with too many questions. For the investigators assigned to the Axeman cases, every location offered pieces of a disturbing picture. A damaged entrance. A sleeping victim. A weapon left behind. A home that looked almost untouched except for the violence that had occurred inside. Yet the scenes refused to reveal the one thing detectives needed most. The identity of the person responsible. In modern investigations, crime scenes are treated almost like silent witnesses. Every object can potentially tell a story. A fingerprint can place someone at a location. A biological trace can connect a suspect to a victim. A digital record can reveal movements and communications. But in New Orleans during the late 1910s, investigators worked in a very different world. Science had not yet reached the level people expect today. Crime scene preservation was limited. Evidence collection methods varied. And investigators often depended on human observation more than technology. A detective entering a house after an attack had to rely on his own eyes, his own judgment, and his ability to remember details later. There was no guarantee that the smallest clue would survive. A footprint outside a home could disappear beneath rain. A piece of clothing could be moved by a curious neighbor. An object could be touched before anyone understood its importance. In the chaos following a shocking crime, protecting evidence was not always the first instinct. People wanted answers. They wanted to help. They wanted to see what had happened. And sometimes, without realizing it, they changed the scene forever. This reality made the Axeman investigation even more complicated. The attacker appeared to understand the advantage created by darkness and uncertainty. He entered homes when families were least prepared. He left before witnesses could react. And he created crime scenes where the most important evidence was often the absence of something. There was no stolen property. No clear message. No obvious personal connection. Only violence. That absence forced investigators to study patterns. They looked beyond individual attacks and searched for similarities. The victims often shared certain characteristics. Many were members of Italian-American communities. Several were connected to small grocery businesses. Many attacks occurred at night. The attacker appeared comfortable moving through residential areas. But patterns can be deceptive. A person investigating a series of crimes wants connections because connections lead to suspects. However, connections can also create assumptions. The investigators had to consider multiple possibilities. Was one person responsible for all the attacks? Was there more than one attacker? Were some crimes unrelated but influenced by the fear surrounding the earlier cases? These questions followed the investigation from one crime scene to the next. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery for residents was the realization that the attacker did not need to bring his own weapon. The weapon was often already inside the home. A household object. Something ordinary. Something that belonged to the victims. That detail transformed everyday items into symbols of danger. An axe was no longer just a tool. A kitchen object was no longer just part of daily life. The things people used to build, repair, and maintain their homes could also become instruments of destruction. That psychological impact extended far beyond the actual crime scenes. People began looking at their own homes differently. The familiar became threatening. The ordinary became suspicious. A quiet evening was no longer simply quiet. It was a moment filled with possibility. As investigators continued examining the evidence, they also had to deal with another challenge: public pressure. The newspapers followed every development closely. Each new article increased attention and intensified demands for action. Readers wanted the authorities to stop the attacker. Families wanted reassurance. Officials wanted results. But investigations do not move according to public fear. They move according to evidence. And evidence was limited. The police could describe the attacks. They could describe the victims. They could describe the methods. But describing a criminal is not the same as identifying one. The difference between those two things became the defining struggle of the case. A description creates suspicion. Evidence creates proof. And proof remained painfully out of reach. The investigation also became complicated by the number of theories circulating throughout the city. Some people believed the attacks were connected to organized crime. Others believed the victims had been selected because of personal disputes. Some suggested that anti-Italian prejudice influenced the way the crimes were interpreted. Others wondered whether newspapers had exaggerated similarities between separate incidents. In a city already filled with rumors and legends, every possibility competed for attention. The truth became buried beneath speculation. Then came one of the strangest developments in the entire case. The Axeman, or someone claiming to be him, communicated directly. The letter that appeared in newspapers in March 1919 changed the investigation dramatically. Before the letter, the attacker existed only through crime scenes and victims. After the letter, he became a voice. A personality. A figure who seemed to want the entire city to know he was watching. The message was unlike anything investigators had encountered. It did not provide a name. It did not offer a motive. Instead, it was theatrical, threatening, and designed to create fear. The writer claimed to be a supernatural force rather than an ordinary human being. The language was dramatic, almost like something taken from a horror story. Whether the letter truly came from the killer remains debated. But its impact was undeniable. The city reacted. People who had previously tried to ignore the danger were forced to confront it directly. The threat was no longer only hidden in dark bedrooms. It was printed in newspapers. It was discussed openly. It became part of daily conversation. And then came the strangest demand. The writer claimed that on a specific night, he would spare homes where jazz music was being played. The idea seemed absurd. A killer choosing victims based on music? To modern ears, it sounds impossible. But in 1919 New Orleans, where jazz was becoming one of the city's defining cultural forces, the message created an extraordinary reaction. People listened. Restaurants prepared music. Dance halls welcomed crowds. Families played jazz inside their homes. The entire city seemed to participate in a strange experiment. And when the night passed without another reported attack, the legend surrounding the Axeman grew even stronger. The event did not solve the case. It did not reveal the killer's identity. But it transformed him from a criminal suspect into a piece of American folklore. For investigators, however, the letter created another problem. Was it real? Was it a confession? A performance? A hoax? A publicity stunt? The possibility that someone other than the killer wrote the letter could not be ignored. In criminal investigations, attention can be valuable. But it can also be a distraction. The letter created a new mystery inside an already mysterious case. Meanwhile, the physical investigation continued. Detectives still needed a suspect. They still needed evidence. They still needed something stronger than fear and speculation. As the months passed, one fact became impossible to escape. The Axeman had managed to do something rare even among notorious criminals. He had controlled the story. Every attack created headlines. Every rumor expanded his legend. Every unanswered question made him more mysterious. But behind the legend was a reality far less dramatic and far more painful. Real people had suffered. Real families had lost loved ones. Real neighborhoods had lived through nights when sleep became difficult and trust became fragile. The investigation was not simply a search for a famous criminal. It was a search for justice. But justice requires a person to hold responsible. And the person who had entered those homes remained hidden. The crime scenes had revealed the damage. They had revealed the method. They had revealed the fear. But they had not revealed the face. And that face would remain one of the greatest unanswered questions in the history of American crime. The longer the Axeman remained unidentified, the more the investigation changed. At the beginning, authorities were searching for a criminal. Later, they found themselves searching for a pattern. And eventually, they were searching for something even more difficult to capture. A shadow. The evidence suggested that the person responsible was not simply committing acts of violence and disappearing by chance. The attacks showed a disturbing level of consistency. The method of entry, the timing, the choice of sleeping victims, and the use of household weapons created a recognizable signature. But a signature is not the same as an identity. A signature tells investigators that the same hand may be responsible. It does not reveal who that hand belongs to. That distinction became the central frustration of the case. Every new attack seemed to confirm the existence of a dangerous individual moving through New Orleans, yet every investigation ended at the same dead end. There was no final clue. No witness who could confidently identify the attacker. No object left behind that carried his name. No mistake that exposed him. The Axeman appeared to understand the value of leaving uncertainty behind. Uncertainty protected him. A criminal who leaves a clear trail can be followed. A criminal who leaves only questions can become almost impossible to catch. For the families affected by the attacks, however, the investigation was not an intellectual mystery. It was personal. Behind every police report was a family forced to experience the unimaginable transformation of an ordinary day into a permanent memory of loss. A kitchen where meals had once been prepared became a place associated with tragedy. A bedroom where someone had rested after a long day became a place people could no longer enter without remembering what happened. Objects that once represented comfort became reminders. A chair. A blanket. A doorway. Small things carrying enormous emotional weight. The investigators could examine the physical evidence. They could measure damage. They could record injuries. But they could not measure what remained afterward. The fear carried by survivors. The grief carried by families. The anxiety carried by entire neighborhoods. Those consequences were invisible, but they lasted. The attacks also changed the relationship between citizens and law enforcement. Before the Axeman case, many people viewed crime as something that happened elsewhere, something connected to certain places or certain people. The attacks destroyed that sense of distance. The danger was no longer outside the community. It had entered homes. This created enormous pressure on police. Residents wanted patrols increased. They wanted protection. They wanted to believe someone was watching over them while they slept. But police officers were facing the same uncertainty as everyone else. They did not know exactly who they were looking for. They did not know where he would appear next. They did not know whether the next attack would happen tomorrow or months later. The investigation became a battle against an enemy who controlled the timing. The Axeman chose when to act. The police could only react afterward. This imbalance gave the attacker a psychological advantage. Every time authorities failed to identify him, his reputation grew. Every rumor about him increased his presence. Every newspaper story reminded the city that he remained free. The investigation itself became part of the fear. People were not only afraid of what had happened. They were afraid because nobody could explain why it had happened. One of the most debated aspects of the case involved the possibility that not every attack attributed to the Axeman was actually committed by the same person. This question remains important because history often remembers events differently from the way investigators experience them in real time. Modern audiences see a complete story. Investigators at the time saw fragments. They saw separate crimes occurring weeks or months apart. They had to decide whether similarities represented a connection or coincidence. The temptation to connect events was understandable. The public desperately wanted an explanation. A single unknown attacker was frightening. But the possibility of multiple attackers was even more unsettling. If several people were capable of similar crimes, then the problem was larger than anyone imagined. Yet if investigators focused too strongly on one theory, they risked ignoring evidence that pointed elsewhere. This uncertainty followed the case for decades. Historians, researchers, and crime writers continued examining old records, searching for details that previous generations may have missed. A name mentioned in an old document. A suspect who disappeared. A witness statement that deserved another look. But time creates its own obstacles. Memories fade. Documents disappear. People connected to the events pass away. The distance between the crime and the investigation grows wider every year. The Axeman case became a mystery not only because the killer was unknown. It became a mystery because the evidence itself was trapped in another era. An era before modern forensic science. An era before criminal psychology could provide deeper insight into behavior. An era when a person could vanish into a city and leave behind only rumors. Perhaps the strangest part of the investigation was the way the attacker seemed to exist between reality and legend. The crimes were real. The victims were real. The injuries were real. But the image of the Axeman became something larger than the individual responsible. Newspapers helped create that transformation. The public helped create it. Fear helped create it. A person became a story. A criminal became a symbol. And symbols are much harder to capture than people. By the end of 1919, the attacks connected to the Axeman had stopped. But the investigation did not end with a satisfying conclusion. There was no dramatic arrest. No confession. No trial where the evidence could finally be presented. Instead, the case slowly moved from active investigation into history. The files remained. The questions remained. The victims' names remained. But the person responsible disappeared. For investigators, the greatest failure was not simply that a murderer escaped. It was that they never understood him. They could describe what he did. They could describe where he went. They could describe the aftermath he created. But they could not answer the question that mattered most. Why? Why these victims? Why these homes? Why this method? Why this moment in history? Those questions have survived because the Axeman never provided answers. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of the entire case. A solved crime eventually becomes a story about a person. An unsolved crime becomes a story about absence. The absence of justice. The absence of certainty. The absence of a final explanation. More than 100 years later, the crime scenes have disappeared into history. The homes have changed. The neighborhoods have changed. The city has grown beyond the streets that once feared the sound of footsteps after midnight. But the questions remain. Somewhere between the evidence collected by investigators and the legends repeated by generations afterward exists the truth of what happened. A truth that was once within reach. A truth that may have been lost forever. The search for the Axeman did not fail because there were no clues. It failed because the clues were never enough. And that is what makes the case endure. Not simply the violence. Not simply the mystery. But the haunting possibility that somewhere, hidden inside the forgotten details of the past, the answer may have existed all along. Every investigation begins with a simple belief. Someone knows something. A witness saw something. A clue was left behind. A mistake was made. Somewhere, hidden beneath confusion and fear, there is supposed to be a path leading from the crime scene to the person responsible. But the investigation into the Axeman of New Orleans became a battle against a different kind of enemy. Uncertainty. From the beginning, investigators were forced to work in a world where every possible answer seemed to create another question. The attacks appeared connected, yet the person responsible remained invisible. The evidence suggested planning, yet the motive remained unclear. The victims shared certain similarities, yet no relationship could explain why they had been chosen. The police were not chasing a suspect. They were chasing a pattern. And patterns are much harder to arrest. In 1918 and 1919, criminal investigation was still heavily dependent on traditional detective work. There were no modern databases comparing crimes across decades. There was no DNA technology capable of linking a person to a scene. There were no digital records showing where someone had been or who they had contacted. Detectives had to build their cases through conversations, observations, physical evidence, and intuition. They walked through neighborhoods. They interviewed witnesses. They examined damaged doors and broken locks. They studied the victims' lives. They searched for anything that could transform a mystery into a name. But the Axeman seemed to leave behind only fragments. The first major challenge was determining whether the crimes were truly connected. At first, investigators had to consider every possibility. Perhaps the attacks were separate incidents. Perhaps someone had copied an earlier crime. Perhaps the similarities were simply the result of similar circumstances. After all, many homes in New Orleans shared similar construction. Many families owned similar household tools. Many crimes occurred at night because darkness naturally provided advantages to criminals. A careful investigator could not simply assume. They had to prove. But as more attacks occurred, the similarities became increasingly difficult to ignore. The victims were often attacked while sleeping. The attacker frequently entered through a rear entrance. An axe or similar weapon was involved. Valuable items were left untouched. The crimes appeared personal, yet no obvious personal connection existed. The pattern was becoming clearer. The identity was not. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was the lack of a traditional motive. Motives help investigators narrow possibilities. A robbery suggests one type of suspect. A personal feud suggests another. A business dispute creates another path entirely. But what kind of person enters a home, attacks sleeping victims, and leaves money behind? The question haunted investigators. The crime seemed to reject ordinary explanations. Some theories focused on the backgrounds of the victims. Because many were Italian immigrants or members of Italian-American communities, some investigators and members of the public considered whether organized crime connections might exist. In the early 20th century, stereotypes and suspicions surrounding Italian communities were common, and those assumptions influenced how certain crimes were interpreted. But suspicion is not evidence. A victim's background does not explain why they were attacked. The investigation had to separate prejudice from facts. That was not always easy. The case unfolded during a period when newspapers had enormous influence over public opinion. Sensational reporting could transform a suspect into a villain before evidence had been properly examined. Rumors could spread through the city faster than investigators could verify them. Every new theory created another distraction. Every rumor demanded attention. And every false lead consumed valuable time. Among the names that surfaced during the investigation was Frank Doc Mumphrey, a man also associated with variations of the names Monfrey or Manfra. Like many suspects connected to famous unsolved crimes, his name became part of the story because investigators and researchers found certain details worth examining. But suspicion is not conviction. No evidence ever proved that Mumphrey was the Axeman. His connection to the case remains part of the larger mystery rather than a solved explanation. This was the problem investigators faced repeatedly. There were possibilities. There were theories. There were people who attracted suspicion. But there was never enough to move from suspicion to certainty. The investigation also suffered from another major obstacle. Fear itself. When a community becomes frightened, people begin searching for danger everywhere. An unfamiliar person walking through a neighborhood may suddenly appear suspicious. A stranger asking questions may seem threatening. A rumor repeated enough times may begin to feel like fact. Police had to examine information carefully because the city was filled with fear-driven reports. Some people genuinely wanted to help. Others may have exaggerated what they knew. Some may have mistaken ordinary events for signs of danger. The investigation became a process of separating reality from panic. And that was not easy. Perhaps the most important witness in any criminal investigation is often the person who saw the attacker. But in the Axeman case, that opportunity was extremely limited. The crimes happened at night. The victims were usually asleep. The attacker avoided confrontation. He did not remain long enough to be clearly identified. His greatest advantage was the moment he chose. The moment when human awareness was at its weakest. Sleep. For investigators, this created a frustrating contradiction. The attacks were highly personal because they occurred inside homes. But they were also strangely anonymous because the victims rarely had any chance to see their attacker. The person who came closest to identifying the truth was often someone who had already experienced unimaginable trauma. Survivors such as Louis Bissouma, Harriet Lowe, Anna Schneider, and Sarah Laumann could provide important information, but the violence itself affected their ability to remember. Investigators had to work with incomplete memories. A face remembered only vaguely. A movement seen for only a second. A sound in the darkness. Details that felt insignificant during a moment of terror could become important later. But sometimes those details were already gone. The investigation continued through months of pressure. Police officers were expected to protect the city while also admitting they did not know who they were searching for. That was a difficult message to deliver. A city wants certainty from those responsible for protecting it. But sometimes the truth is uncertainty. And in the Axeman case, uncertainty became the defining reality. Then, in March 1919, the investigation entered a strange new phase. The arrival of the Axeman letter changed everything. Until that moment, investigators were dealing with a silent attacker. A person who communicated only through violence. But the letter introduced a new possibility. The killer wanted attention. The killer wanted control over the story. The letter did not provide the evidence police needed. Instead, it created a new mystery. Who wrote it? Was it truly the Axeman? Was someone seeking publicity? Was someone trying to create panic? Or was the attacker revealing a side of himself that investigators had never seen before? The letter forced police to investigate not only crimes, but a personality. The anonymous figure in the shadows had suddenly stepped forward. Not with his name. Not with his face. But with words. And those words would send the entire city into one of the strangest nights in American criminal history. A night when New Orleans would answer a threat with music. A night when jazz became connected forever with the legend of the Axeman. But even after that extraordinary event, the central mystery remained unchanged. The city still did not know who he was. The police still did not know where to find him. And the investigation continued moving through a maze of suspects, theories, and unanswered questions. The search for the Axeman had become more than a hunt for a criminal. It had become a fight against time itself. Because every day that passed without an arrest allowed the legend to grow stronger. And legends are much harder to capture than men. The investigation into the Axeman of New Orleans was never a straight path. It was a maze. Every road seemed to lead somewhere, but many ended in darkness. Every suspect carried a possibility, but few carried proof. Every theory offered an explanation, but none could survive the full weight of the evidence. For detectives, the case became an exhausting search through uncertainty. For the public, it became a story that grew larger with every unanswered question. And somewhere between those two worlds existed the truth, a truth that investigators could sense but never fully reach. After the attack on the Cortimiglia family and the growing fear surrounding the case, police faced increasing pressure to identify the person responsible. The public wanted action. Newspapers demanded progress. Families wanted reassurance that the person who had entered homes during the night would not strike again. But the reality facing investigators was far more complicated. They did not have a clear suspect. They did not have a confession. They did not have a witness who could provide the one detail that would change everything. They had only a collection of crimes connected by frightening similarities. The challenge was determining what those similarities meant. Was the attacker a stranger selecting victims at random? Or was there a hidden connection between the victims that investigators had not discovered? This question became one of the central mysteries of the case. At first glance, the victims seemed connected by geography and circumstance. Many lived in similar neighborhoods. Many belonged to immigrant communities. Several were connected to small businesses. But investigators needed more than coincidence. They needed a reason. A motive. Something that explained why one person entered one home instead of another. Without that explanation, the suspect list remained impossibly large. Anyone could become a possibility. And when everyone is a possibility, no one is. The police began examining individuals who attracted attention through rumors, suspicious behavior, or connections that seemed relevant at the time. One of the names that appeared during the investigation was Frank Doc Mumphrey, also associated in some records with the names Monfrey and Manfra. His name became connected to the case through theories that developed over time, but no evidence ever established him as the Axeman. Like many figures associated with famous unsolved crimes, his place in history exists in the space between suspicion and certainty. That space became crowded with many names. Some suspects were investigated because of criminal backgrounds. Others because of personal conflicts. Others simply because someone believed they acted strangely. But strange behavior is not the same as guilt. A person can appear suspicious and still be innocent. A person can have a questionable past and still not be responsible for a specific crime. This distinction is obvious today, but it was much harder to maintain in a city consumed by fear. The investigation was also influenced by the social atmosphere of the time. New Orleans in the early 20th century was a city of different cultures, languages, and communities living closely together. Immigrant neighborhoods were vibrant centers of family life and commerce, but they also faced prejudice and misunderstanding. Because several victims were Italian immigrants or Italian American, some theories focused heavily on that connection. Some suggested criminal organizations. Some suggested personal disputes within communities. Some suggested revenge. But those theories often relied more on assumptions than evidence. The victims' identities became part of the investigation, but they also became part of the speculation. And speculation can lead investigators away from the truth. The police had to ask a difficult question. Were the victims chosen because of who they were? Or were they simply available targets? That question remains unanswered. Another obstacle came from the limitations of communication and record-keeping at the time. Today, investigators can quickly compare information from different cases. A pattern can be identified across cities and states. In 1918 and 1919, that process was far slower. Reports were handwritten. Information traveled through newspapers, letters, and personal communication. Different departments did not have the instant access to shared databases that modern investigators rely upon. A clue discovered in one place might not immediately reach the people who needed it elsewhere. In a case where small details mattered, delays could be devastating. The investigation also suffered from the passage of time. The longer the Axeman remained free, the harder it became to reconstruct events. People forgot details. Memories changed. Witnesses became less certain. Evidence disappeared. Time became another barrier standing between investigators and justice. Yet perhaps the greatest obstacle was the nature of the attacker himself. The Axeman did not behave like a criminal seeking money or recognition in a traditional way. He did not rob his victims. He did not leave behind a clear message after every attack. He did not claim responsibility publicly until the infamous letter. His behavior seemed designed around creating fear rather than gaining something tangible. That made him difficult to understand. Criminal investigations often depend on understanding human motivation. People usually act because they want something. Money. Power. Revenge. Escape. But what did the Axeman want? The answer seemed to change. At times, he appeared to want nothing except violence. Then came the letter. And suddenly, it appeared he wanted the city to know he existed. The letter became one of the most important moments in the entire investigation because it shifted the focus from physical evidence to psychology. Investigators began examining not only what the attacker had done, but how he wanted to be perceived. The writer described himself in dramatic, almost theatrical language. He presented himself not as an ordinary criminal but as something larger, almost supernatural. Whether the letter was genuine or a carefully designed hoax remains debated. But its effect was real. It gave the Axeman a voice. Before the letter, he was a figure moving silently through the darkness. After the letter, he became a presence that seemed to speak directly to the entire city. The police now had another question to investigate. Who would write such a message? Was it someone seeking attention? Someone attempting to create panic? Someone connected to the crimes? Or someone completely separate from the attacks? The letter created possibilities but did not provide answers. In fact, it may have created even more uncertainty. The famous jazz threat inside the letter became a turning point. The idea that Holmes playing music would be spared was so unusual that it seemed almost impossible to connect with ordinary criminal behavior. Yet New Orleans responded. The city played music. People gathered. Families participated. For one night, fear and culture became connected in a way that history would never forget. But when the night passed without another reported attack, the investigation did not become easier. It became stranger. Because now the Axeman was no longer just an unknown attacker. He was a mystery with a personality. A person who seemed capable of violence and theatricality. Someone who could inspire terror without even appearing. For investigators, this was both a clue and a distraction. A criminal who enjoys attention may reveal something about himself. But attention can also hide the truth. A performance can be a mask. The letter might have revealed the real Axeman. Or it might have revealed nothing more than someone's imagination. The investigation continued. Detectives followed leads. They examined suspects. They listened to theories. But the case refused to close. Years later, researchers would continue studying the evidence, revisiting old suspects and questioning old assumptions. Some believed the answer was hidden in forgotten records. Others believed the truth disappeared forever. But in 1919, investigators did not have the luxury of history. They were standing in the middle of the mystery. They had a city waiting for protection. They had victims waiting for justice. And they had an unknown person who had managed to become one of the most feared figures in New Orleans without ever revealing his face. The Axeman had accomplished something terrifying. He had turned absence into power. Every unanswered question made him stronger. Every unsolved attack made him larger. Every night without an arrest became another chapter in a story he had written through fear. And as the investigation moved forward, detectives faced the hardest reality of all. The person they were searching for might be closer than they realized. Or he might already have disappeared forever. By the final months of 1919, the investigation into the Axeman of New Orleans had reached a strange and frustrating stage. The city knew more than it had known at the beginning. But somehow, it also felt as though it knew less. The attacks had created a recognizable pattern. Investigators understood the method. They understood the timing. They understood the type of locations the attacker seemed to prefer. But understanding the crime did not mean understanding the criminal. That difference separated the Axeman case from many other investigations. The police were not searching for an ordinary suspect who had made a mistake. They were searching for someone who had managed to disappear behind uncertainty. Every investigation depends on connecting two things: the evidence and the person. In this case, the evidence existed. The person did not. As months passed without an arrest, frustration grew inside law enforcement circles. Detectives had spent countless hours reviewing information, interviewing witnesses, and examining possible connections. But each path seemed to dissolve before reaching a conclusion. The case became a collection of unfinished stories. A suspect questioned but released. A theory considered but abandoned. A clue examined but never proven. For the public, these dead ends created the impression that the Axeman was always one step ahead. Whether that was true or not, the perception itself became powerful. The attacker had become almost impossible to separate from the fear surrounding him. The name Axeman no longer represented only a person. It represented the possibility that danger could appear anywhere. A person walking home after dark. A family preparing for sleep. A business owner closing the store. Anyone could imagine themselves as the next victim. That was the psychological impact of the case. The attacker did not need to be seen to influence behavior. He existed through anticipation. Through fear. Through the questions people asked themselves when the lights went out. Who is outside? Did I lock the door? What if tonight is different? This was the environment in which investigators continued their search. One of the most difficult parts of the case was the lack of a reliable description of the attacker. In many crimes, witnesses provide a starting point. A face. A height. A voice. A distinctive feature. But the Axeman's method prevented that. He attacked during sleep. He entered when awareness was at its lowest. He left before anyone could react. The few survivors who might have provided information had experienced overwhelming trauma. Their memories were affected not only by time but by the circumstances themselves. A moment of extreme fear does not always create a perfect memory. Sometimes it creates fragments. A sound. A movement. A feeling. A vague image that may or may not be accurate. For investigators, fragments were not enough. They needed certainty. And certainty never arrived. The investigation was also complicated by the possibility that the Axeman might not have been a single individual. This remains one of the most debated aspects of the case. The similarities between the attacks are striking. The nighttime assaults. The use of an axe. The method of entry. The lack of robbery. The connection to certain neighborhoods. But similarity alone does not prove a single offender. Crimes can resemble one another for many reasons. A method can be copied. A rumor can influence behavior. A frightened public can connect events that may not belong together. Investigators had to consider all possibilities. But each possibility carried its own problems. If one person committed all the crimes, then how had he avoided capture for so long? If multiple people were responsible, then why did the attacks appear so similar? The uncertainty created a problem with no easy solution. The media played a significant role in shaping the public image of the case. Newspapers did more than report events. They helped create the legend. The mysterious attacker became a character in a larger story. The public wanted explanations, and newspapers provided theories, possibilities, and dramatic interpretations. Some reports focused on the horror of the crimes. Others focused on the mystery of the unknown attacker. The more attention the case received, the more powerful the legend became. And legends create their own challenges. A detective investigating a person can search for facts. A detective investigating a legend must first separate fact from imagination. The Axeman letter represented the perfect example. The message was dramatic, threatening, and unusual. It seemed designed to create fear. But was it authentic? No one could say with complete certainty. If the letter came from the actual attacker, it offered a rare glimpse into his personality. If it was a hoax, it was simply another distraction in an already confusing investigation. Either way, it changed the public perception of the case forever. The person responsible was no longer just someone hiding in darkness. He had become someone who could communicate. Someone who appeared confident. Someone who seemed to enjoy controlling the emotions of an entire city. That psychological element fascinated investigators and later researchers. What kind of person would commit such crimes and then invite attention? Was the attention the goal? Was fear itself the reward? Or was the letter simply an attempt to create confusion? Without the author's identity, the questions remained unanswered. The police continued examining possible suspects, but no individual could be connected to the crimes with enough evidence to justify prosecution. This is an important distinction in any criminal investigation. Suspicion is not justice. A person can appear likely. A theory can seem convincing. But a courtroom requires proof. And proof was exactly what the Axeman case lacked. The investigation eventually reached a point where activity slowed. Not because the mystery had been solved. Because there was nowhere else to go. The attacks stopped. The leads disappeared. The urgency faded as years passed. The case moved from an active search into history. But history has a strange habit. It keeps asking questions. Decades later, researchers continued examining the Axeman case. They studied newspaper archives, police records, and old accounts. They revisited suspects and reconsidered theories. Some believed the answer was hidden among the original suspects. Others believed the wrong assumptions had guided investigators from the beginning. Some suggested the Axeman may have been someone completely unknown. A person who lived an ordinary life after committing extraordinary crimes. That possibility remains one of the most unsettling ideas connected to the case. The idea that someone could create such fear and then simply return to everyday existence. Go to work. Walk through familiar streets. Speak with neighbors. live without ever being exposed. The investigation failed to provide closure. But perhaps the most important lesson from the case is not about the person who escaped. It is about the people who were left behind. The families who lost loved ones. The survivors who carried memories they could never erase. The communities that learned how fragile safety could feel. The Axeman became famous because his identity remained unknown. But the victims became important because their lives were real. They were not characters in a mystery. They were people who had ordinary hopes before tragedy entered their homes. More than a century later, the investigation continues only in historical records and the minds of those who remain fascinated by unanswered questions. The police never discovered the final piece of the puzzle. The city never received the confession it wanted. The courtroom never delivered the verdict people expected. The Axeman disappeared into history. But the investigation left behind a warning that continues to echo. A crime does not need to be solved to leave a lasting impact. Sometimes the unanswered questions are exactly what allow a story to survive. And sometimes, the most frightening part of a mystery is not what we know. It is what we may never know. Every great investigation reaches a moment when everything appears to change. A new piece of evidence emerges. A witness remembers something important. A suspect makes a mistake. A hidden connection finally becomes visible. For investigators, that moment is what they spend months, sometimes years, searching for. The breakthrough. But the Axeman of New Orleans was never a case that followed the rules of ordinary investigations. The closer authorities came to understanding the mystery, the more complicated it became. There was no single dramatic discovery that revealed the killer's identity. No confession waiting at the end of a long interrogation. No piece of undeniable evidence that suddenly transformed suspicion into certainty. Instead, the breakthrough in the Axeman case came in a different form. It came through the realization that the killer was not only attacking bodies. He was attacking the imagination of an entire city. The most important turning point was not a fingerprint. Not a weapon. Not a witness. It was a letter. A strange, theatrical message that appeared in March 1919 and would become one of the most unusual pieces of communication ever associated with an American criminal case. Before the letter appeared, the Axeman existed only through actions. He was a presence without a voice. A figure defined by what he left behind. Broken entrances. Injured victims. Fear. But the letter changed that. Suddenly, the person behind the attacks, or someone claiming to be that person, stepped out of the darkness. The city had spent months trying to understand an invisible threat. Now, the threat appeared to speak. The letter was reportedly sent to newspapers and published on March 13, 1919. The writer presented himself not as an ordinary criminal, but as something almost supernatural. The language was dramatic. The tone was confident. The message seemed designed not simply to threaten, but to create an unforgettable image. The writer claimed to be a force beyond ordinary human understanding, describing himself as a being connected to darkness and evil rather than simply a man committing crimes. To investigators, the letter created a completely new challenge. A criminal who remains silent can be studied through actions. A criminal who communicates must also be studied through words. The question was no longer only, who committed these attacks? It became, who would write this? What kind of person would want an entire city to read his words? What did he gain from creating fear on such a large scale? The letter provided no name, no location, no direct confession that could be verified. But it revealed something important. The writer understood the power of attention. Fear grows in silence. But fear becomes stronger when it has a story. The letter gave the Axeman a story. And New Orleans listened. People gathered around newspapers, reading the words that claimed to come from the person responsible for the attacks. Families discussed the message in homes and workplaces. The letter became the subject of conversation across the city. The attacker, whoever he was, had achieved something unusual. He had reached thousands of people without entering a single house. The psychological impact was enormous. Residents who had already been nervous now felt as though they were being directly addressed. The danger was no longer only something that happened in the darkness. It had a voice. It had intention. It appeared to be watching. But the most bizarre part of the message was still to come. The writer claimed that he would continue his attacks on a specific night. However, there was one condition. Homes where jazz music was being played would be spared. At first, the idea seemed almost impossible to understand. Why would a killer choose victims based on music? Why jazz? Why would an act of violence become connected to one of New Orleans' most important cultural traditions? To understand the impact of the message, it is important to understand the city itself. New Orleans was not simply a place where jazz existed. Jazz was part of the city's identity. It flowed through neighborhoods. It filled dance halls. It emerged from clubs and gatherings where musicians created something new from different cultural influences. Music was not just entertainment. It was expression, community, life. So when the letter connected survival with jazz, the entire city responded in a way that only New Orleans could. Instead of hiding completely, people filled the streets and homes with music. Restaurants prepared performances. Bands played through the night. Families participated. The city turned a threat into a strange act of defiance. For one evening, music became a symbol of resistance against fear. And then something remarkable happened. The night passed. No major attack connected to the Axeman was reported. The city survived. But the mystery only deepened. For the public, the event strengthened the legend. To some, it seemed like proof that the letter had come from the actual attacker. To others, it suggested that the entire situation was a bizarre coincidence or a carefully designed publicity stunt. For investigators, the problem remained the same. The letter created more questions than answers. If the author was truly the Axeman, then what did it reveal about him? Was he seeking attention? Was he attempting to manipulate the city? Was he enjoying the power created by fear? Or was the letter written by someone completely separate from the crimes? Every possibility had weaknesses. If it was genuine, why reveal anything at all? If it was fake, why did it appear at such a significant moment? The investigation entered unfamiliar territory. Police were no longer only searching for physical evidence. They were trying to understand a personality they could not identify. And psychological clues are difficult to use when the person behind them has no confirmed identity. The letter also changed how people imagined the Axeman. Before, he had been a shadow. Afterward, he became almost a character. The public began imagining the person behind the words. Was he intelligent? Was he unstable? Was he seeking fame? Was he hiding in plain sight among ordinary citizens? The absence of answers allowed imagination to fill the space. And imagination often creates something more frightening than reality. For investigators, however, imagination was not enough. They needed facts. They examined the letter. They considered possible writers. They questioned whether someone might be using the Axeman's reputation for personal reasons. But once again, the investigation reached a wall. No definitive author was identified. No connection was proven. No arrest followed. The letter became one of the greatest mysteries inside an already unsolved mystery. Yet it represented a turning point. The Axeman was no longer simply an unknown attacker. He had become a figure who could influence an entire city without appearing. That ability to create fear from a distance was perhaps the most powerful weapon he possessed. The police had been searching for a man. But the letter revealed something more complicated. They were searching for someone who understood fear itself. And as the investigation continued, detectives would begin examining suspects more closely than ever before. Names would emerge. Theories would grow. Some would appear convincing. Others would collapse under scrutiny. But none would provide the one thing the city desperately wanted. An answer. Because the greatest breakthrough in the Axeman case did not reveal who he was. It revealed something even more unsettling. The person behind the attacks had managed to make an entire city feel powerless. And powerlessness was exactly what allowed the legend to survive.